Welcome to episode 7 of the Bioenergetic View. In today's episode, we'll be going over Peter Attia's admission that he was wrong about fasting and that it caused him to lose muscle mass. We'll discuss whether fasting is optimal just because our ancestors went through periods of scarcity. We'll go over whether fructose is as damaging as alcohol, like Anthony Chaffee and Robert Lustig suggest. We'll discuss whether methionine restriction is a good idea for increasing lifespan and what alternative may be a better approach. And we'll also go over tips for optimizing gut health and avoiding seed oils while eating out at restaurants. And with that, let's jump right in.
Okay, a bioenergetic view with Jay Feldman and Mike Fave. And we don't have anything to intro today, so we're just going to get right into around the internet section. So awesome. We're going to talk about Tim Ferriss and Peter Attia, long, well-known people in the health world, and they're discussing fasting. And Peter is setting up his, rearranging his thinking about fasting and that it's possibly harmful. So here we go.
Anyway, when I looked at these metrics, I was shocked. I was shocked at how much less muscle I had than 10 years earlier, almost exactly 10 years sooner. And, I attribute it to several things, but I really thought that chief among them was just how much fasting I had been doing over the previous 3 years. I had really kind of taken fasting to a pretty extreme place, doing up to 10 days of water only and routinely just busting out 7-day water only fasts. Certainly doing 3 days every month would be, something I would do without hesitation.
When you say 10 days of water only, over what period of time is that?
Meaning like how frequently would I do that?
Yeah, I'm just wondering what the cadence was if we take it as a minimum to be.
Probably quarterly.
Got it.
Yeah, probably every quarter. And while I certainly think there are some benefits from doing that, I think what I was sort of confronting was, wow, there's actually a pretty big cost as well. Mm-hmm. And I would go out of my way while fasting to still exercise. I was lifting weights every single day, which was difficult sometimes, but doing everything I could to sort of try to stimulate muscle protein synthesis. But at the end of the day, if you're not providing any nutrients, including amino acids, you're basically just tearing down muscle to try to rebuild with that muscle, but your net effect is a loss. So
Jay, what do you think the cost was? And then why do you think his ancestrally consistent worldview did not catch that after 10 years?
Yeah, so there's a couple of really notable things here, as you're saying. So for one, the cost he's discussing is just a loss of muscle, which I think is not catching the entire cost here. The major stress, the depressive effects on thyroid and testosterone and whatnot. I don't know what his experience was and what other things he was doing, but those are inherent effects of fasting. And he's not, in this clip, he's not talking about just intermittent fasting. He's talking about massive fasts, like periods of starvation, 3 days, 10 days, which is crazy. But also, as we'll talk about in another clip, he was also intermittent fasting throughout this entire time. He talks about that just being normal eating to him, is having 2 meals a day in a short window. So yeah, in this clip, he's saying that the main reason why he stopped doing it was because he was recognized 10 years later that he was losing muscle, which is, again, a long time to be doing something that's that damaging. And I think also largely missing the real issue here. And as we'll continue to talk about through these clips, he's focused on, again, it all being muscle centric and trying to do things to prevent muscle loss, like working out. And next clip, he talks about BCAAs. And then later he's talking about protein, and still, I think, completely missing the point, completely missing the harms and costs here of fasting that we'll dig into. But as we go along as well, I think, you mentioned the ancestral point of view, and he discusses in one of these later clips what led him to, this is one of the later clips is when he was fasting. And he explains why it is that he's doing it. And it becomes really clear that his reasoning is not sound. It's not a great place to be working from. And that is, I would argue, what led him to be doing something so damaging for 10 years. And I think is really important when we're looking at anybody, whether it is a major figure in the health sphere or not, is considering their argument for these things. And, it's okay to change your mind. It's okay to recognize that something you were doing was wrong. That's great. We all want to be open-minded, but that doesn't mean we want to, it is reason to be careful following anybody's advice, and why we really want to evaluate critically how they're coming to do the things that they're doing. And as we work through this with Peter Attia and fasting, I think it is it really highlights that. And yeah, so we'll dig into that. But that's just a bookmark I wanted to make.
My context is usually following the science. What do you guys think about that?
Absolutely.
Yeah, of course.
100%, Danny, following the science.
Got it. So
I think when you look at these guys and I think how they're thinking is the biggest problem. I think the whole context and frame with which these guys view, or the lens with which they're viewing these topics, is the problem. It's extremely reductionistic. It's not viewed in any type of overarching system. There is actually no context, or the context is flimsy. And so then you get these weird, like super hyper, or these hyper focused ideas of like, well, the body is made to handle starvation, and it has all these adaptive backup pathways to manage starvation. And then inside that line of argument, it's like, well, these are just assumed to be good because of X, Y, and Z reductionistic pathway inside the research. And it's easy to come to those types of understandings or decisions when the frame is off, because essentially you can create a frame for many types of arguments. They may not be true, but inside the frame, they make sense. And I think the biggest problem is how these guys go about these things. And this is really important for me, this is how I'm discerning what they're doing, is looking at how they're thinking about some type of topic. And that is a massive difference between keto, biohacking, or like some of the bioenergetic spheres ideas, and like specifically Ray's ideas and Ray's topics. And the other thing to put into perspective here is, if they are figuring this stuff out now about intermittent fasting and super long fasts, I cannot wait until we shift gears on keto and low carb and resveratrol and cold showers and all these other things, because essentially right now, Peter Attia is focusing on fasting as a problem because it's catabolic towards muscle tissue. And there's something going on with mTOR signaling and all these types of things, which we'll get into in a second. It's a very weird way to think about, like, I'm going to try to take BCAAs to stimulate mTOR so that I can maintain my muscle mass while I lower mTOR with fasting to increase my lifespan or to have these health benefits. But I think we're going to start to, if he shifts his frame to any perspective and starts to look at things in terms of stress or in terms of energy metabolism, then the house will have to crumble. Like, there's no way that you can shift to stress and energy metabolism as a frame and the problems of things like fasting, and then still continue to promote cold showers and keto and low carb and things along these lines. And so it's like the slippery slope has started in these spheres. And then when you start to dig into the research, and when the entire context gets adjusted, it's like, well, then you're going to have to adjust your thinking around NADH to NAD, NADH and NAD ratios in respect to FADH to FADH ratios and all these types of things. And then what happens with fatty acid oxidation inside the mitochondria. And essentially, like, all the pieces start to fit together, and the whole low carb biohacking stuff starts to fall. And again, it's because the frame with which they're looking at things, the lens, is not correct. The lens is faulty from a purely logical and rational level. It is faulty because and part of that is because of how reductionistic it is. No matter how many papers you go in through all these types of things, when you start to put things together in a cohesive system, this stuff falls flat. And essentially, that was the stuff that I know that I came to when I was doing low carb. Like, when Jay and I were going through it, this was the stuff we started seeing. This stuff we started reading Ray's work. We started looking, changing the context, changing how we think about things, not just what is the actual content of our thinking. And then when we started to change the view, is like, man, what are we doing? Like, this stuff doesn't even make sense. And then we were like, had to, swallow that pill and move on. Luckily, we didn't have huge audiences and like books and things out about how ketosis is the best thing ever. And then we had to shift gears entirely and, things along those lines. But we had to swallow that pill personally. And that's why before we even did this stuff, we had gone through keto, carnivore, low carb, all this type of stuff, fasting, whatever, cyclical ketogenesis and carb backloading, whatever these different things are, and realize, like, no, all of these things are these really reductionistic frames that are reductionistic lines of thinking that don't fit into a cohesive argument. And then you find Ray's work, and it's like, man, this guy he got it. Like, he put all the pieces together.
Yeah, well said. Just if you change your mind, that's not a bad thing. But if you're constantly changing your mind, it means your worldview makes no sense. So,
right. And as you were saying, Mike, like that was a time where we were shifting through a lot of different modalities, and we were in a very immature state in terms of the way we were thinking about things, in terms of the thought process. As you said, forget the content. It was how are we considering these things? And that was 10 years ago, right? Like our thinking continues to evolve and our views shift, but not like they did prior to that point 10 years ago. And there's a major difference. And that's why we're starting to see not just Peter Attia change his mind on fasting, but so many of the people who are all about fasting starting to shift. So many people who are all about low carb starting to shift. And yeah, the important point here is it's okay to change your mind, but we want to be able to identify the immature thinking and what leads someone to that place as an important means of whether to, like, how much stock to put in somebody's view of something.
Well, every time you think low carb or keto or fasting are gone, they circle back around.
Oh, of course.
Like every single time. So I remember being in an ancestral health symposium in 2011. Dude, the feeling in the air there was that low carb was over. And there were low carb speakers that I remember a lot of the people I was with were like, next, please, next. Like they were over it. And then it came full swing back around, like Dave Asprey and Jack and stuff like that. But yeah, absolutely crazy. Go ahead, Mike.
I think that so what you're referring to, Danny, is like when somebody's changing their mind all the time and they're just like, essentially there's a difference between there's a couple things here actually. So there's a difference between having an experience like fasting multiple, like quarterly, doing long fast quarterly and doing intermittent fasting daily, and then looking at your actual data and seeing that after 10 years of doing this and working out religiously and making sure you're eating enough protein, all type of stuff, you have actually lost muscle mass. Like when you have data like that and you can see that, if you ignore that, you can't ignore that. If you have any degree of rational thinking, you cannot ignore that. And so in Peter Attia's circumstance, it's like he has to now change how he thinks about this particular thing because the data and the real life experience has told him that his theory is incorrect. And that is actually how you go for when I work with somebody or when I'm framing things with people, you have to actually look at your real world data. And you're, instead of trying to constantly prove a theory or prove some line of thinking, what you're trying to do is look at your real world data and see if that theory is actually correct. And that's gonna be a really important piece. The problem is that the frame with which he's going about thinking about this, instead of changing how he's looking at the picture and looking for a broader context to understand why this isn't correct, he's just shifting over the content. And so in certain circumstances with certain people inside the health store, you see they jump from repeat to vitamin D as a toxin to Morley Robbins stuff, and then back to low carb and all these types of things. This person is not learning. This person is just shifting from one thing to the next. He's not actually learning how to think about these things. They're not diving deep into the information and getting a real grasp of it and figuring out where the nuances are and where the problems are and why this piece doesn't make sense, and then testing it out and seeing real world information. So they don't actually get a learning process. They're not testing out their theories or their perspectives, and they're not looking at real world. They're just that something doesn't work. They're not fully in. They like jumped in, something doesn't work, and then they switch because it's not working instead of figuring out the process. And that's like the lowest level, I would say, of thought processes overall. And I don't mean that in a subjective way. I mean that objectively. In the next tier, you have something with like what Peter Attia is doing, where he's forced to see that his perspective or his theory is not working. Instead of trying to adjust the perspective, and perhaps the wheels are starting to turn, I don't know. But instead of like fully adjusting the perspective, he's just kind of switching the content around fasting. Like, okay, well, fasting doesn't work because it's catabolic to muscle tissue. The question is, will he expand the way he's thinking about these things into the next context? And so then that's kind of a mid-level. And another layer you can see is like you have a change in the content, and you can shift content when something doesn't work. But then you can also say, like, is the frame with which I'm thinking about these things correct? And that's changing again. how you think. And that is like an evolution of your thought processes. Instead of moving in a lateral plane, you're moving vertically in terms of your ability to think about something. Whereas in these other spheres, the lowest one, I don't even know what's going on over here. It's just like this kind of schizophrenic way of going about things. And then the middle level is kind of moving horizontally around the information that you're thinking about.
You can make lots of money on that low level though. So
yeah. Just to clarify too, Mike, what you're saying, so experience is really important, but we don't want to just go around testing every single possible dietary iteration as if they all could be equally right, because we're easily swayed by weak arguments. And, again, just clarifying, because you were saying this, but so it's great that Peter Attia looked at had a bad experience and looked at it, but the fact that he was doing it in the first place based on very faulty reasoning and that it took him 10 years while he was recommending it the entire time is not something to look up to. That is
no.
Yeah.
The reason I bring that piece in there is not like in a congratulatory. I mean, I think it's a good thing that he's actually open to shifting his frame about this stuff and actually publicly discussing it. But what I'm really throwing that idea in there for is for the people who are on carnivore right now and they're having insomnia or they're on keto and they're like, they're crapping their brains out or whatever the deal is. And then they're going on like our carnivore on Reddit and the moderator is telling them that, oh, you just need more salt, you just need more tallow, you just need more this, you just need more that. And it's like one of the main things is take your experience into perspective and detach from the ideologic element and see like, this isn't working for me. What's the next direction I go? Because I think that to develop like how you're shifting your frame, you do to some extent go through these experiments and periods before you get comfortable with really trusting your own experience on these different components. Now, should it take 10 years? Probably not. But I guess there's an individual element. But that was kind of more how I was thinking about it. Because I think a lot of people will get so engrossed in a theory about something and they will ignore the actual real life experience that they have on a regular basis. And then that will allow you to keep plowing through because this theory is so good on paper. But then when you're actually doing something in your life, it's like there's problems. Like this stuff is not doing what it's supposed to do. So yes, should it take 10 years, all type of stuff? No, but like I think testing something out and figuring out is important. And then also before you go and jump into something, actually vetting it appropriately and discerning it is really powerful. But to learn that, you also have to kind of go through it a little bit. Because for us, that's what we went through, right? We went through a period of time where we were trying to discern what makes sense in testing things out. And then after you get burned a little bit, you start to learn.
Yeah, we're all guilty of that, being obsessed with the idea that's not true.
Yeah. I think that's a stage that you have to go through to some extent so that you understand it very viscerally before you can move into the next tier of how you think about things, right? Because it's like you're learning how to think as you're thinking about things in these different ways.
Yeah. Okay. Let's to hear him talk about BCAAs.
I'm glad you brought up the leucine, lysine, and methionine, because I was going to ask earlier if while you were fasting but losing lean muscle mass over time, you were supplementing with, say, branched chain amino acids in any fashion.
I used to always drink BCAAs during workouts. And for folks listening, there are 3 branched chain amino acids. And, leucine is hands down the most relevant of them. And we know from work that our mutual friend David Sabatini has done in his lab that, leucine is a very, very potent mTOR stimulator. In fact, it might be the single most potent stimulator of mTOR. mTOR, of course, acutely, you want that thing stimulated. It's promoting growth. You don't want it chronically stimulated, but you want it acutely stimulated.
What do you think, Jay?
Yeah, I don't think there's too much to add. It's just, I wanted to make sure we had that part in because in the next one as well, he talks about this idea that it's all just about protein. And if you have enough protein while you're fasting and you eat enough protein while fasting or while intermittent fasting, you're okay. But obviously, at the very least, the BCAAs weren't enough to prevent, considerable muscle loss for him. But I don't have too much else to add there. I just wanted to include that little piece.
Aren't the BCAAs insulinogenic? And so couldn't they like lower his blood sugar more, making the stress more intense?
Yeah. I mean, working out while fasting, I think, is a pretty bad idea as well. And he was talking about how hard it is. It's like the main cost of fasting is this major stress, and you're driving that harder. And if it did maintain muscle mass, or the amount of muscle mass it did maintain, that is taking that much more energy from every other bodily system. That's even worse. Like you're maintaining muscle mass at what cost to your brain, to your liver, to your kidneys, to your reproductive function. I mean, we'll get into it because he talks about later how fasting increases epinephrine. That's a good thing. And that's why we should be fasting. When we go back to his earlier reasoning, he was aware of that, but there's no consideration that stress is actually harmful and comes at a cost. Yes, BCAA is not enough to prevent muscle loss. And as you said, yes, insulinogenic, just to add to the stress that he's already under.
Before you go, Danny, I want to add something here is that, so this is actually something that I hear a lot from like some of the young guys that I work with. It's like, oh, I'm going to like take BCAAs to stimulate mTOR. What I want to put into context with people here is that while BCAAs stimulate mTOR is a signaling cascade. So you also need other amino acids to actually like grow the tissue. Like it's not just like leucine will grow it by itself. So actually having enough protein is important overall. But the piece with the fasting stuff is that you're fasting plus you're working out, and like these aren't small fasts. Like no amount of signaling for growth is going to overcome the level of catabolism that you put yourself in when essentially like people, we talk about caloric deficits or something like that. A 7-day fast is a massive caloric deficit. Like I don't even like you have 0 calories for 7 days straight. The level of catabolic processes that you upregulate in that time frame, especially if you're doing it quarterly, and then you're doing 3-day fasts at other times, and then you're doing intermittent fasting on other days, is insane. It's absolutely an insane level of catabolism to be functioning on a regular basis. And people will be like, oh, well, the body has all these mechanisms in place that will stop you from losing muscle tissue and all these backup pathways. It's like, yeah, you're slowing down your metabolism so that you don't shred all your lean mass to make glucose, and you don't shred all your fat mass really fast so that you die. So it's like, that is not what you want to optimize for, slowing the system down so that you can function at like the lowest level of subsistence because of some arbitrary pathway about fasting. And then turn around and be like, oh yeah, I lost some muscle doing this. It's like, there's way more things that probably went on besides just muscle loss overall. And then the last piece I want to mention here, Danny, in response to what you're saying about BCAAs and blood sugar, is that BCAAs do lower blood sugar, but they actually have a gluconeogenic response. So they will actually trigger gluconeogenesis as well, which is not like those are things that you don't want to optimize for, like just slamming BCAAs all day long so that you have an insulinogenic response, and then you have the mTOR response. You don't have the other amino acids that are important for building the tissues. And then you also are having this like increased gluconeogenic response. Like all of these things are not good. Not to mention the problems with like fasting optimizes again for fatty acid oxidation, which we've talked about ad nauseum across all of our channels as being a problem.
This is just speculation, and we're kind of saying like, why would anybody stick to something that was so harmful, But my interpretation of Peter Attia is he's pretty type A, and so he might have kind of stuck to this for energy. You know what I mean? Like he might have been running on the stress, and maybe if he stopped at some point, that was he would slow down. And so again, not like, oh, what idiot would stick to this fasting thing? He might have interpreted it as like a positive type of thing that he could get everything he needed to do done. I'm sure he has a busy schedule, and sometimes you get caught in that, you get quantum looped, and your health suffers for that. But
well, and he alluded to that too in the last clip about like why he's going into fasting and talking about the epinephrine making him sharper and like better. I mean, of course we'll get there, but it's like, yeah, he needs it to function. Like he's totally running on stress hormones.
Yeah. That's funny because
the other thing,
I was going to say being on adrenaline is like the opposite of functional. Like my experience with adrenaline is like you can't listen to somebody, so they'll be talking, but you'll be having a conversation in your head that inhibits you from even understanding what they're saying. And I know the feeling very well. Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, what I was going to say is that you should be able to be in a state where you can actually function while eating. So that I know this is like a foreign concept in some of these spheres, but like once in my experience, like the fasting thing is legit. Like I remember when I was in college and I was fasting in the mornings, and then I'd eat my first meal at like 12 or 1. In the morning, I'd be super productive. But I also, when I was doing that in low carb, I couldn't sleep. I was sweating all the time. I was anxious, and I was always cold. Hands and feet were cold. So like, was it productive for that? Yes. But once you dial the diet in the right way, and you kind of get things organized appropriately, you should be able to eat carbs and protein and fat and like have actual meals and still be able to function. So like that, for me, that was one of the gauges that I determined for myself, or like set for myself, when I started to get better with this stuff and figured the different pieces out. Was like, oh wow, I can actually wake up and have this, have a bunch of fruit and juice and this different protein source. And I actually still like, I get work done, but now I'm just not a sweaty, anxious nightmare. And I actually slept 8 hours straight last night. So it's like, there is a way to function appropriately while still eating and not having to optimize for those stress hormones, especially because they definitely come at a cost in the long run. And I see actually, besides Peter Attia and some of the biohackers, there's like other spheres where people are talking about like fasting or carnivore and all these things and all these types of benefits. Like, these things are short-lived for a lot of people. Some guy like Peter Attia or Sean Baker or whoever, maybe they can do it for a long period of time, but a lot of people actually crash in the long run doing this type of stuff. And it also, as far as like optimizing your ability to think, I think it's problematic in the long run, because you're unable to move into a broader perspective and zoom in and out. You like kind of lose really higher order function thought processes because you're so tense and you're so tight, and maybe you get a bunch of things done, but like some other areas suffer. So there's a cost as well in function, and you should be able to function without having to like run through these different hormones. Plus, long-term upregulation of glucocorticoid signaling is known. Like, this isn't questionable or anything like that, but like running on the stress hormones damages the central nervous system directly. So like long-term glucocorticoid signaling will basically melt the hippocampus in the brain. It's not something that you want to like really strive for long-term, even though there's some short-term benefits of it.
I don't need my frontal cortex, but Jay, what do you think about that?
I could leave mine too, but yeah, it's such a good point, Mike. It's looked at as a badge of honor, right? So a couple of things. One is being able to skip meals and not have a good appetite and everything is looked at as a good thing. And being able to perform and not have food get in the way of your life. Like, those things are looked at as optimal outcomes. And he alludes to this and talks about this in other clips that we didn't include here, where I think he was talking with Joe Rogan and was talking about how active he is and how much muscle he has. And Joe was like, wow, you must have a really strong appetite. He's like, I did a long time ago, but not really anymore. I just skip meals and, I don't eat that much. And as you said, I mean, a 7-day fast, if let's say his caloric needs, so to speak, are like 3,000 calories a day, we're talking about 21,000 calorie deficits. Like, this is insanity. And as in the way that, as you were discussing, Mike, you are forcing that metabolic dial to go way down in order to maintain function, in order to survive, in order to live. And that means turning down thyroid activity. It means turning down testosterone. It means turning down cognitive function, turning down digestive function, everything. And then you need the stress hormones to be able to perform, to be able to like exist and think, because that metabolic dial is so low, you've tanked your metabolism. And again, he talks about this, how you need the epinephrine and norepinephrine to make you sharper and, be able to function. We know that we want to eat in a way to minimize stress hormones like cortisol while maximizing our metabolism. But when it comes to creating a diet to do so, there's a lot of conflicting information out there. And that's why I've created the Energy Balance Food Guide to help you determine exactly what to eat to optimally support your metabolism and help you lose weight, improve your digestion, get amazing sleep, boost your energy, and so much more. The Energy Balance Food Guide is a one-page infographic that organizes foods on a spectrum based on how effectively they support your metabolism, and it also has a separate spectrum that adjusts this scale for you in the case that you're dealing with various digestive symptoms. This food guide makes it extremely easy to get started with a bioenergetic approach to optimizing your health. So head over to jfeldmanwellness.com/guide to download your free Energy Balance Food Guide. Yeah, I think shifting that narrative around this being a badge of honor to eat less, to skip meals, and instead to shift it toward, I can eat twice as much as I used to and maintain my weight and feel really good after I eat, and be able to focus and be able to function and sleep and not be anxious and be able to think clearly. And as you were saying, Danny, like not get stuck in your own thoughts and like not be able to have and a legitimate interaction with somebody. I think those should be the badges of honor. And I hope that at some point that narrative starts to shift. But yeah, obviously it's nowhere near as sexy when you have to like prepare a meal all the time, or you have to bring snacks with you when you leave the house, as opposed to just saying like, hey, I got by, fasting the whole day and I was totally fine. And plus I activated autophagy. So, cleaning up all my damaged tissues. So,
well, very, very well said. Okay. So let's get to these this is a Joe Rogan one, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
You got to understand.
Do you want to do the other one first, Jay, or do you want us to do
the other one?
Yeah, do the other one first, because the Joe Rogan one is like the old version of what led him to the thought process in the first place, which I think is it just illustrates exactly what you're talking about. But yeah, this other one is still talking about his new views of fasting. Okay. So
there's no magical benefit of time restricted feeding in terms of the impact on body weight beyond the caloric deficit. But the problem is, on average, people lose more muscle because they're restricting protein more.
So what if there's a woman that does have muscle? Would you say to go to intermittent fasting, or would that still be sort of last on your list?
I guess it depends how big a fasting window she's talking about and whether she's willing to maybe have a protein shake outside of the fasting window. If you could just get a little bit of protein in, let's just say she says, okay, fine, I'm only going to eat between 2 and 8. If you could have a protein shake at 9 in the morning and then have a protein lunch at 2 and then a protein dinner at 8, I would say that would be worthwhile. And just make sure that protein shake that you're having in the morning is very otherwise low in calories.
Peter sounds like he's aping Ted Naiman now.
Yeah, I have one thing to say, and it's protein.
Yeah.
The problem is like, it's just, but this defeats the reason of why they discuss fasting in the first place, right? It's like, we're fasting because we want to lower mTOR, because lowering mTOR has this benefits in longevity and all this type of stuff. And then it's like, but we don't want to lose muscle mass. So we're going to have a bunch of amino acids that likely stimulate mTOR in the fasting window and all these types of things. It's like, I remember when I was first coming to fasting, the number one thing was like, don't have something that stimulates insulin or mTOR in your fasting window. So it's like, you can have coffee, you can have green tea, you can have water, but God forbid you have a carbohydrate. God forbid you had like something that had dairy, or God forbid you had a protein source, especially BCAAs. Like, you are going to minimize the longevity benefits, the health benefits of fasting beyond the caloric restriction piece. So now it's like this soft shift where it's like, oh, the only benefits of fasting, and he specifically said for weight loss, is caloric restriction. And this is known. Like, researchers have been saying this in different papers consistently, is that fasting just makes it easier for a lot of people to eat less. That's essentially it. But then the long-term, besides the mTOR stuff, besides that being kind of like, I don't know, hypocritical or paradoxical, like to start changing the guidelines like this, there's still this complete lack of understanding of part of the catabolic process is up-regulating stress hormones. Like, it's cortisol, adrenaline, glucagon, all these types of things. Like, this is still not being talked about. And I have a sneaky suspicion that we give it, a couple more months, and then maybe a year, maybe a couple of years, whatever the deal is. And then that conversation will start being brought into the picture. And it's like, oh, there's this guy, Hans Selye, and he was talking about how stress is cumulative. And it's like, so maybe we shouldn't just be like optimizing for all of these stressful things on a consistent basis. And we're still not having that argument here. And I think that is actually the big base overall. And that is even beyond just like the catabolic effects on muscle tissue. It's talking about the other effects on the systems overall. So yeah, this is it. Yeah, the picture is just, it's like this, it's a soft shift, but it's still missing the overall point.
Totally missing the point. So fasting is not equivalent of calorie restriction. And the reason why people have worse effects for fasting is not because they're just consuming less protein. So in the studies where they look at, diets that have the same number of calories, but one has a time restricted window and the other doesn't, the time restricted window loses about the same weight, and they lose way more muscle mass and less fat mass. And that's because the catabolic situation, first off, is not just due to the amount of calories coming in, but it's actually due to the timing. It's due to not eating consistently. And it's not due to not having protein consistently. If you actually wanted to prevent the catabolic state, you would have carbohydrates, right? Isn't who was talking about how they were going to start using glucose to prevent the catabolic effects of fasting, but still get some supposed benefits? It was one of the biohackers. And again, just totally missing that what's happening here is when you don't have the carbohydrates available consistently, blood sugar drops, stress hormones kick in to produce the glucose and shift over to fatty acid oxidation. And that's inherently catabolic. It's not only going to destroy muscle tissue, but also is going to downregulate your metabolic state, because those same stress hormones, glucagon, adrenaline, cortisol, downregulate thyroid activity and conversion and production, downregulate testosterone production, all of those things cause massive issues. And so, yeah, I think, again, this highlights that even though there's been a shift into fasting perspective, where we recognize that there's some negatives there, we still have no concept, and by we, I mean Peter Attia, has no concept of what's actually causing the problems here. It totally missing the point.
All these same people will be on the blueprint with Mike soon enough. So there's always somebody that breaks frame and creates like a new one, like what whatever his face is doing, Brian Johnson. But go ahead, Mike. Sorry.
Oh, it'll be yes, the blueprint, Danny.
Well, it's working for you, so
yeah. The transdermal estrogen, like I've been really debating getting my toes and my fingers done, but lately I've just been doing my fingers. Yeah, the whole I don't know if it's like, I don't know if a lot of these guys are like slowly shifting over on purpose, or if they really are just like that tunnel visioned on the whole context and just focusing so much on just like purely muscle catabolism and not looking at any of the other components.
To be fair, I bet Peter Attia has no clue who Ray Pete is. Like he seems like he operates in a different world. You know, he's not like internet sleuth, like figuring out what people are thinking. I bet Peter is so divorced from what's happening. I mean, and he should be. He probably has bigger like things to do than to care about what people are.
But it's not even Ray, Danny. It's like if you learn anything about stress, like you go through Hans Selye's work. And like if you actually read Hans Selye's work,
yeah, of course,
or any of these authors talking about these things, or if you do read any research on the effects of glucagon in any of these disease states, or if you look at the effects of adrenaline or upregulating the sympathetic nervous system heavily, or if you look at the effects of glucocorticoids, or you look at any components of hormones, or if you look at any of the mitochondrial like dynamics in terms of fatty acid oxidation versus carb oxidation, or the effects of these hormones on this function, like I don't understand how you can create these biohacking arguments talking about all these different types of things and not see those things. Like I don't see how you couldn't get to that and be like, oh, well, maybe there's some like discrepancies here with with this perspective.
I think it's probably easier for us to say because we had this like package land in our laps of like everything making like a lot of sense, but like reaching that, like for example, when I was paleo and carnivore, people regularly talked about Hans Selye. Like there was an idea to try to limit stress in your life, but that just had nothing to do with carbohydrates or calcium or et cetera, keeping the intestine in good shape. You know, it was just this concept that people intermittently invoked, but it had like nothing to do with the ketogenic diet or the carnivore stuff. And so, I mean,
but that's a good example, right? Because that's the perfect example. What the problem is that everything, the way a lot of systems are set up and like systems of thinking is like everything is compartmentalized into these different sections. Yeah. So like the idea of stress or Hans Selye idea of stress, like, oh, this is something important to know, but not in the context of anything else. Yeah. Right. So you don't think about that in terms of diet or in terms of these different hormones or whatnot. It's like, oh yeah, there's this really cool theory here. Yeah. And I think part of the problem is like like the way we grow up and we're educated is like, that's how we're actually taught to think about things. It's like, you just get these like this, it's trivia. It's like this really great trivia system where you learn all these facts for a test and you forget everything. And there's like no overarching, context with which you're learning these things and why they become important and making connections. And I also think that's part of the reason why a lot of people don't actually remember the information they learn is because it's not situated in any type of framework. So it's literally, you're not learning anything in anything. And then the other thing is like, we have these ideas that we completely divorce our knowledge from our experience instead of integrating our knowledge and our experience and saying like, does this theory actually play out in my experiences? Can I understand this through things I do in everyday life? It's like, no, we need to look at our DEXA scans over the course of 10 years or like our bioelectric impedance scans to be like, oh, if you look at this trend on this graph that I made for my scans, I lost, X% muscle tissue over these past 10 years and then backtrack from that instead of like taking into account all like there's tons of other metrics that we completely miss. And I think this is also a problem of like the precision medicine stuff that I think eventually will be brought in through the biohacking sphere. Is that like the way everything is thought about is like parsed and compartmentalized into these nice packages, and the way everything is viewed is like the system is just a function of the adding the parts of the whole, and there's no understanding of like a synergy of things and how all the pieces interrelate. It's like you could just take these gears, you could just take skin and bones and cells and throw them in a pile, and you have the human body.
This is partly why I only pay attention to hair mineral analysis tests. So that's just joking. Anything else, Jay, before we move on?
No, we can. I'm sure we'll share some, final thoughts after this last clip.
Okay, so here we go.
You got to understand, if our ancestors couldn't function when they were hungry, we wouldn't be here. So it's not just that starvation, a short-term adaptation to starvation is necessary. It's probably beneficial. In other words, during these short periods of deprivation of food, we get just a little bit more epinephrine and norepinephrine. We just get a little bit sharper, a little bit better. I can't even remember what it's like to eat 3 meals a day. It's been so long.
Really?
Yeah.
How long have you been doing this?
I mean, I've been doing crazy for 10 years, nutritional wise. Like, I spent 3 years in ketosis where it was actually one day I was in ketosis for 3 years, lots of fasting, but I think intermittent fasting or time restricted feeding, probably at least 5 years.
More power to him.
This was, for reference, like 5 years ago.
Yeah. I think the thing that rubs a lot of people the wrong way is the certitude. Like, how many people did he recommend? He's a doctor. How many people did he tell to fast, et cetera, et cetera. And kind of in typical fashion, a lot of these people aren't like apologetic about possibly destroying people's health over the long term. I can't recall a single apology in the health world ever.
I don't even see a logical argument there though. Right. His whole thing was like, our bodies, should be able to deal with starvation. And then the next argument after that is, so it's likely a good thing. It's like, that's not a logical progression. That is just straight conflation based on his like.
But that's how we evolved.
Yeah, it's purely genetic determinism.
But even then, it's like that's how we evolved. So, like, we evolved to have this backup pathway, so it's assumed to be good. That there's no connection that makes zero sense. There's no logical direction there. Like, that's not an argument for anything. That's like, I told you to do this and you asked me why. And it's like, because I said so, because it's evolutionarily consistent. It's like, that is not an argument.
Well, yeah, but we have to actually explain why that's not an argument, because so many people get caught up in that, right? It's, well, carbohydrates weren't available for this period of time, and these people in the ice age that, on and on, or we would have fasted, so it must be good for us. Most people don't recognize how weak of an argument that is. And so I think it's important to spell it out. And obviously, we see the progression here with Peter Attia's effects of trying to mimic his ancestors. But essentially, in short, there's a couple of important points. So one is that even if our genes were built around constant starvation and whatever else, the model that we are like of genetic determinism, that we are programmed to do something, so anything that is a derivation from that is inherently negative, is not accurate. And instead, if we provide a better environment, it can actually support us further and allow us to achieve better health and more progress. So that's part one. So even if there were only 200 grams of carbs available regularly on a daily basis instead of 250, that doesn't mean 250 is not ideal. That could be even better. And that's because there's a two-way interaction with our environment, and our environment then helps to shape our genes and on and on. So that's like one important thing to point out. But I guess another that I would say is, or the flip side of that is, just because we subsisted or made it through times of scarcity doesn't mean that we want to be mimicking that. And it doesn't mean that didn't lead to reductions in our brain capacity and reductions in our in our function. And people point, the same group of people points to how 10,000 years ago there's the introduction of agriculture and grains, and since then our brain size has shrunk, right? So if that was the case, and we're saying that now we're in this suboptimal period because we've been consuming grains for 10,000 years, I would say that is the exact same argument that you can make about going through periods of starvation or periods of low carbohydrates, periods of basically scarcity in the environment, that those would have been times when we would have contracted as species. We would have reduced our function. And instead, we want to go the other direction. We want to expand. We want to improve health and longevity and function and brain capacity and all of that. And that involves abundant energy. You can't have that without having enough energy there. And so I think that's important to at least put out there to people who are totally new to that idea and are still stuck in the ancestral mindset.
Yeah,
the frame is entirely different.
Yeah, like we're not done evolving. The idea is to continue to move forward, and
the evolution is not random. That's the other point, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, the thing is, the randomness argument gets me every time, right? Because it's like, it's still not like, even in the randomness argument, it's not random, because the idea is that if you just have random mutations, then some of these mutations eventually are better than others, and then those mutations get selected for. It's like, what's selecting for those? How do you have something better than other? It's like the environment. So no matter what, it cannot be random. There's no way that you can say that it's random, even in that like line of argument, because you still have some external component that is selecting for it. Besides the fact that the randomness element doesn't make sense overall.
You guys are both familiar with that Mexican cave fish, like that.
Yeah.
You could probably tell it better than I did, but isn't that like proof positive that whole idea is completely wrong? Because these fish adapted, they got diverted into a cave from a fresh river to a cave, and then they became translucent. They lost their eyes. They developed like hypersensitive nervous systems, and none of that is explainable through random mutation. It was a direct Lamarckian shift due to the change in their environment. But yeah, that
in a very short period of time is the important part.
Do you remember how long it was?
Yeah,
no, I don't either.
I think you can even see that though amongst you see that even if you look at like the Galapagos Island stuff with Darwin, is like these different organisms developed in these different environments from the different islands, and they had different outcomes. And it's like the argument that was made was, oh, this was randomness, but again, like you have the environment shaping the outcome. The calling it random seems like tenuous overall.
Yeah, but it's an important distinction to make also, that the mutations themselves and the direction of the genetic change is also not random. So it was always genes first, and then whether it fit into the environment, which is very different from the actual trajectory of the evolutionary mutation, so to speak, or the change in genes is driven by the environment or affected by the environment.
Yeah. But I think that I agree with you 100%. We come from the same perspective, but I think that the line of argument that people come from there, it goes down to almost like a nihilist perspective that all things are discrete and random. And inside, when you start looking even in the random argument around the evolutionaries, I know we're getting into the weeds, but when you look inside that, it's like you're still seeing directionality. Like you're still seeing like selection for certain things, and which would preclude randomness in and of itself.
Yeah. Even then it wasn't 100% random, but yeah, there's still, as you were saying, there's still huge problems. Even within that view, there's some major issues.
Yeah. Last thing.
And I think, go ahead, Danny.
Well, I was going to say the Barbara McClintock stuff, and she, I think in her paper, she called the genetic material a modifiable organelle. So it was modifiable based on the organism. So it was just another part of the cell that could change. And then I think Dennis Noble has a few chats on the internet, and he has really basic graphs of talking about how the environment is affecting what's the genetic material. So it's not that central dogma of one way. Go ahead, Mike.
Well, you already see the soft shift, right? Because you had this like hardcore genetic dogma. We're going to synthesize the genome, or we're going to, read the whole genome, and then we're going to cure all diseases. And then that happened, and it's like, okay, epigenetics now. Now then the environment interacts how the genes are read and all this type of stuff. So it's like this stepwise shift out of this perspective of pure genetic doctrine. but I feel like the genetic doctrine, I feel like this conversation is really important because if you start looking at current perspectives in some of these different areas, when you like start zooming all the way back to where the ideas come from, like the whole evolutionarily consistent type of thing, it comes out of these dogmas. Like it's kind of an extension of these dogmas overall. And so that's why it's important to kind of go from there. And then like, I think that's Ray started with nutrition, but then he gets into like the change in the philosophies and how like that this is, again, it's changing the framework with which you're looking at things, the lens in which you're viewing things. So if your lens of viewing things, and for me, this was a huge thing out of Ray's work, is seeing the purposefulness of existence and seeing that with existence, like the idea that energy and structure are interrelated at every level, that you can spiral things upwards. So if you have more structure and you have more energy, it's like this exponential process moving forward. You can also like spiral things down in the opposite direction. Whereas the existing dogma is just like everything is moving towards chaos or entropy and destruction. And that they're like everything's these discrete particles and everything is functioning through randomness. And like if you're functioning under those ideas, then it's easier to fall into these reductionistic traps inside your logical lines of thinking and start moving into these evolutionarily consistent neo-Darwinistic ideas. But if you see purpose in things and you see direction and you see principles interacting with each other in systems, then you can like change how you view all these things that come down the line after that. So I think it's super valuable. I know it's like we're just talking about fasting with Peter Attia, but like the way of frame shift is happening through like taking these things all the way back down to their base and saying, okay, does this make sense? Like, does this line of argument make sense? Do we have examples counter to this? Are the examples that they're using actually making sense? And like, what's playing out in my real life?
I think it's evolutionary consistent to be a glycolytic blob with dominated by stress hormones. What do you think about that, Jay?
I mean, I think that's spot on. And I think coming back to the other side of the argument that he makes, which is not just that our ancestors did it, so it must be good, but also that it's a way to increase epinephrine, which is adrenaline. Like those are the same things. So, and that makes us sharper and better. I think also goes to, again, this lack of larger context. I mean, by that logic, we should all be shooting up with glucocorticoids all the time for their anti-inflammatory benefits. Like totally missing that these are signals of the energetic state of our environment. And when we're in a state of scarcity, when the energetic state is poor, when we don't have enough fuel coming in or nutrients, or we have, the influence of various toxic substances that impairs mitochondrial respiration and impairs energy production, then that is going to these stress signals. There's no like free improvement in function. These are going to turn down your metabolic rate. I know we've said it a bunch of times, but he acknowledges that like this is going to increase stress, but there's and physiological stress, right? He's not saying, as long as you aren't psychologically stressed, you'll be okay. He is acknowledging that this will increase physiological stress, but there's no concept that comes at a major cost. That is telling us to essentially contract evolutionarily. It's telling us to turn down our cognitive state, to turn down our thyroid, all of those things that keep our metabolic rate up. And yes, just as a caveat, in the short term, you'll get the burst of energy, but long term, you will crash. If you'll lose muscle mass, sure, but you'll also be anxious and you'll have insomnia, and you'll have low testosterone, all those things. So yeah, I know we're hammering down a point that we've made a few times, but I think it just becomes super clear when you look back at that line of reasoning that he shared there. I'm sure there was other things too that he didn't share, like Mike discussed in terms of mTOR. But this is, I think, if there's one thing to impart on the listeners here, it's to try to or work to critically evaluate those sorts of thought processes. And when someone says sugar is toxic and inflammatory versus recognizing that sugar is the quickest way to turn down stress, I mean, those are complete opposites. And it's frustrating or difficult for someone who's new to those things because it requires digging in and having some basic understanding. But I think we want to be very careful when people are making arguments along the lines that Peter Attia was.
Yeah. Well, the last piece I'll add just quick. Go ahead, Danny.
No, you go.
The last piece I add that was quick is just that there's also he mentions it in terms like, we'll just turn up that adrenaline just a little bit. And it's the lack of context that there's a cumulative negative effect of these things. So it's like, you're going to do your cold showers, you're going to do your ketosis, you're going to do your fasting, you're going to put your exercises on top. You're going to do continue to do all these things, like just a little bit, just a little bit, just a little bit. It's like if you understand stress, you know that these different a variety of different stressors are activating the same pathways. So you are cumulatively upregulating the same pathways. It's not just like this stress causes this here and this stress causes that there. It's like you are activating the same systems. And again, in a short term, you need these systems not to not have them. But if you're chronically driving that, it's definitively coming at a cost. And not thinking in terms of a cumulative nature is highly problematic. And that's what happens when you start getting into as a reductionistic element.
Got it. Well said. Okay, let's move on to bioenergetic basics. And today we're going to talk about the amino acid methionine. And so, Jay, I don't know, give us just a quick rundown. Like, why is this important? Why would anybody care about methionine?
Sure. So so a place to start is methionine restriction is well studied as something that lengthens lifespan in animal models. And so it's of particular interest because of that. And there's concerns about too much methionine because of that. It's one of the main amino acids that's involved in muscle protein synthesis. As a building block for muscle, it's also involved in liver detoxification pathways, as you're showing up on the screen there. And it's one of the main ones that we're going to be getting from muscle meat in our diet or from dairy. It's generally going to be high in those and low in connective tissue-based protein sources like collagen or gelatin, bones, those kinds of things. And so, yeah, there are some important considerations to have, but kind of big picture, that is methionine. And we'll be sharing a couple of quotes here from Ray. But one thing that I know he's mentioned, I remember hearing him mentioning, was that part of the reason why high methionine can act as a potentially harmful signal is because it can be a signal of muscle breakdown. So essentially it can be a signal of stress, where if we are starving, if we are doing long-term fasts or anything along those lines, we'll be breaking down a decent amount of muscle tissue and losing protein, like, losing muscle, like Attia, was experiencing. And with that, you'll have a large release, consistent release of the amino acids from the muscle, and that'll include higher amounts of methionine. And so Ray mentioned that is part of why the body recognizes it as a harmful signal, is because it's a sign of essentially starvation. So yeah, I'll start with that. And then
this is very similar to eating a very high fat diet. You're basically mimicking the stress response. And so cortisol breaks down the large skeletal muscles, releasing methionine. You want me to read this one?
Yeah.
Okay. This is from Ray's, I think, 2006 Protective CO2 and Aging article. He says parental stress, prenatal stress, early life stress, and even stress in adulthood contribute to imprinting of the genes, partly through methylation of DNA and histones. Methionine and choline are the main dietary sources of methyl donors. Restriction of methionine has many protective effects, including increased average 42% and maximum 44% longevity in rats. Restriction of methyl donors causes demethylation of DNA. The age-accelerating effect of methionine might be related to disturbing the methylation balance, inappropriately suppressing cellular activity. Besides its effects on the methyl pool, methionine inhibits thyroid function and damages the mitochondria. So that was when I was first getting into repeat. The last line was the only thing I committed to memory, was that those methionine, tryptophan, and cysteine suppress thyroid function, and that's all I could remember about that stuff. But I remember it being people talking about it in that way, and it was a lot longer before I had any type of experience with that. So how does a person internalize that, and how do they approach that if they have some health problem? Mike?
I think that the amino acid question, in terms of like viewing things through the lens of restriction, is quite difficult to implement overall, specifically around restriction. And so there's a couple things that I think is important to discuss here. So in the rat studies where they did methionine restriction and they saw the increase in lifespan, they generally start the restriction when the rats are a bit younger. and there's some costs that come to that. Like the rats don't develop as much body mass and muscle tissue, and there's some metabolic changes at the liver and things like that. So it's important to look at like lifespan changes and see like, oh wow, the lifespan increased. But it's also important to look at like, what are the other effects that occur even though you're getting this increase in lifespan? Because there's also like elements of quality of life. So that those are also a function. So I think that just trying to restrict methionine actually, while perhaps it increases lifespan, I think that it is largely difficult to do and problematic because it is useful in some of these other circumstances. So you may get issues with the liver, you may get a smaller stature, you may get loss of muscle tissue, things along these lines. And something that I think is really important to put in context here is that if you were to have this loss of muscle tissue and change in all these other functions, you may actually predispose yourself to higher mortality, not because of chronic diseases or something like that, but maybe because of infection or because of you fell when you're older and you broke your hip or something along those lines from frailty, things from that perspective. So I think that's important to consider. Another thing that I think is really important to consider with the restriction type models is in rodent models, as an example with caloric restriction, when you restrict calories in rodents and you start it when they're young, you see an increase in lifespan, of course. However, when they move to the rhesus monkey models, when you restricted calories in some of the rhesus monkey models, when the monkeys were young, they actually had less of a lifespan. Now, what does this mean in terms of methionine? In my perspective, I think that the things that you're seeing inside rodent studies are not fully playing out entirely in the monkey studies. And I think that you also have another huge jump between monkeys and humans. So whether you'd get the same exact effect between monkeys and humans or between the rodents and humans, I think would be problematic. Now, I don't think that Ray's perspective overall in terms of like methionine having some of these negative effects is incorrect. I just think that the actual practical implication or implementation of this is very difficult to do from a restrictive perspective only. So bringing this into practical terms, if you were trying to lower methionine in your diet to the level that you see inside these rodent studies, you would have to eat like a really low protein diet, and you'd have to use very specific protein sources. Like you'd pretty much just take dairy, meat, seafood, and things like this off the table because they will be high in methionine. They'll also be high in tryptophan, cysteine, and all these other amino acids. So I think it'd be really hard to construct a reasonable diet that has a decent amount of nutrient density and that also is like has enough calories and things like that if you're trying to restrict all these amino acids. Another one that is often discussed is arginine. Now, the last perspective that I'll say here is that you don't have to just restrict these certain amino acids. You can balance some of these amino acids with glycine, and I'll leave it there, Jay, so you can talk about like get into the details of that.
Sure. And for reference, for anyone who's interested in more of the backstory of the problems with all the calorie restriction studies, Mike and I have discussed that in quite a few episodes on the Energy Balance podcast, talking about aging and other things along those lines and breaking down that research. But yeah, in terms of application here, as you were saying, Mike, we would prefer not to restrict methionine heavily because there do tend to be costs there. Not only, so you mentioned, muscle mass, liver detoxification, things like that. Like there is a role for methionine. However, it left unchecked, it can cause issues as well. And so the general recommendation here would be to make sure that we're getting a considerable amount of non-muscle meat. So like collagenous connective tissue based proteins. So it'd be collagen, gelatin, and these can be on their own as protein powders. It can be bone broth. It can be cuts of meat that have the bone and have more connective tissue and that you have to cook low and slow for a long time to get them to be tender. Those are all going to be good sources of connective tissue. And that includes high amounts of glycine and proline and other amino acids that help to balance out the methionine, cysteine, tryptophan that might be in the muscle meat. So in general, the recommendation would be to keep an eye on the balance of amino acids here. And there are studies showing that providing glycine helps to provide the benefit that methionine restriction provides. And so as long as we're getting a good amount of those sources, we should be all right there. And so it's hard to make concrete recommendations. And sometimes I think you can go overboard with this as well, where people are getting over half of their protein sources from connective tissue. And instead, I would normally recommend somewhere in the 15 to 30% range from connective tissue. And that's, again, hard to parse out. If you're just having muscle meat and dairy and then separately having collagen and gelatin, it might be easy to do. But if you're having meat that has connective tissue built in and has a bone and you're getting the gelatin from the liquid there, it's hard to identify exact amounts. But in essence, what I would suggest is trying, when you're getting meat, to try to focus on ones that have, cuts that have more collagen and gelatin in them. And if you're not going to do that, then I would make a point to get supplementary collagen or gelatin at some point to help balance that out. And adding in extra bone broth or gelatin and collagen can also really help there. So that would be my general kind of basic applications here when it comes to.
Can I throw out more complexity to this? I have talked to quite a few people that were allergic to those gelatin powders, or they caused intestinal distress. And then the other thing is, I was talking to one guy for a long time, and he was having chronic hypoglycemia. And I think he had mentioned to me at some point that he always would add the gelatin to his coffee, and he drank it, like mix it with sugar and milk. But at some point I was like, did you try removing the gelatin? Because I think it's also insulinogenic. Like, I think it can lower the blood sugar. And anyways, he removed it, and his hypoglycemia went away that day or something. So yeah, dude. And then did we talk about why glycine helps with methionine? Is it just like an exclusion type of thing? Does it help detoxify the harmful effects of the homocysteine? Like, what is it doing to help with the excess?
I think we're related to like how some of the metabolism around methionine and things like that require glycine at multiple steps. The body is glycine is required to balance methionine's metabolism in multiple areas. And Chris Masterjohn has actually done some work on this, and he's talked about, there's like a whole panel at one point. It was like Chris Masterjohn, Alex Leaf, I think, and then some guys from examine.com. And they were talking about they weren't talking about collagen or gelatin, but they were specifically talking about glycine and the benefits of glycine in relation to methionine. And essentially, because like, I don't know the specifics off the top of my head, like I'd have to go and pull that back up. At one point I did know it, but it just, the major things that I memorized from that, or like took from that, was the practical application. But the general idea was like with methionine metabolism, there's multiple steps where, not directly or in different areas, that glycine is required to kind of balance it out. So the idea, or the papers, there's a paper on this, was a Spanish study, and they basically looked at how much glycine the human body needs on a regular basis. And I think it wound up being somewhere around 0.2 grams per kilogram per day. And essentially what you wind up seeing inside the human bodies, I think this was for maybe like a 150-pound person, they synthesize about only 3 grams of glycine per day. So when I'm working through this with a client, what I tend to do is I tend to get the protein to be the 0.82 grams per pound per day. And then I will, once diet's solidified and things are going well, then I'll start to tweak the glycine amount through either collagen or bone broth or gelatin or the collagenous cuts of meat, and then possibly add in supplemental glycine if they don't respond to them. Because a lot of people really actually don't respond well to gelatin or to collagen or even to bone broth sometimes. And it could be a variety of issues. Like sometimes the way that gelatin or collagen is made is, I think, perhaps problematic, because some of this, like hides, it's basically they take hides from cattle and they will soak them, I think, in lye, and then let it break down the proteins, or I think it is lye. And then essentially they'll spray dry that out as a powder. And then the collagen hydrolysate, I think, there's another step to make it easier to digest. So the amino acid or the peptides bonds are broken a little bit. So you get these like smaller peptide fragments, which is small chains of amino acids. And I think that some people, they may not fully digest some of those things. So some of them get left and go into particularly from like bone broth or gelatin, go into the colon. And depending on what you have going on the microbiome can ferment those types of things. And then you can get like pretty gnarly symptoms, weird symptoms, rashes, or like kind of feeling off. The other thing that I've noticed with some of those things is for people who have issues with bile acids, like if you had your gallbladder taken out and you start to plug tons of glycine, since glycine is one of the amino acids that's involved with bile conjugation and production, you start getting bile acid diarrhea. And that's actually something that's very personal for me that I've experienced many times trying to like really drive glycine intake. So yeah, and then glycine itself, to your point, Danny, about the blood sugar stuff, glycine itself does have like pretty beneficial effects on blood sugar and like helping to lower blood sugar and inflammation and things like that. And I've had some people take really high amounts of glycine and like find that it lowers their blood sugar too much for them, or it's like too strong. So I don't know, depending on the dose of collagen, perhaps, you know, if you have 10 grams of collagen, I think it's almost 30% glycine. So you can get, I think it's like 2 or 3 grams of glycine just from that alone, if I remember correctly. So yeah.
That bile acid thing happened to me with taurine. That's like why I've never been a huge fan of taking it.
Yeah, taurine and glycine. So I remember when I first like found out about them, I read all the papers. There's all those benefits, and so I don't have my gallbladder, right? They took it out with the surgery, and so I started plugging both taurine and glycine, and then I just proceeded to have bile acid diarrhea for days until I started to be like, can taurine cause diarrhea? Can glycine cause diarrhea? And then I like stumbled upon some articles talking about them being important for bile acid conjugation. I was like, oh, this is probably why.
Yeah.
Which isn't a bad thing. And if, you know, in Mike, in your case, you have to be really careful about this since you don't have a gallbladder. But if somebody else has issues with bile production or bile flow when they're dealing with cholestasis, issues with the gallbladder, things like that, it can be really helpful to use taurine and get that flow going again. You just want to be a little bit careful about it and start with the super low dose. And normally, if you are getting that response, again, assuming you have a gallbladder, if you are getting that response, I would normally suggest continuing at that low dose. The effect will go away. And that's normally a really good sign for getting bile flow going, which for people who are dealing with liver-related issues, which is extraordinarily common because it's just a very central organ, whether you're dealing with endotoxin problems, insulin resistance, PUFA, whatever it is, it'll affect the liver. And so getting the bile flow going again is really important for digestion, for keeping SIBO away, for detoxification, clearing out estrogen, all those things. So I actually think that it can be really helpful because of that, but it's also just a reason to be careful with it.
Yeah. Especially in the peat sphere, I've seen so many people get these like constipation and like lack of bile flow symptoms, right? So like stools are paler and things like that. But what winds up happening is people are either going like super low fat, so you don't have a stimulus for bile flow, or their main fat source is just all coconut oil or something like that. And the coconut oil being mostly medium chain triglycerides doesn't really stimulate a massive, like the bile acid contraction or release of cholecystokinin, which causes bile flow and all these types of things, because this doesn't need bile acids to be absorbed. It's kind of passively absorbed in the upper portions of the small intestine and the stomach. So in those cases, using taurine and glycine and then changing fat sources around, so you have a little bit more longer chain fats. So whether that's adding in some butter or adding in some beef tallow or some chocolate or something along those lines, you tend to see people's like stool pattern and function improve pretty significantly, just that. And then the other thing that's important, I think, to add to that is that if you stimulate bile flow and you haven't done it for a while, having some fiber sources, fruits, vegetables, whichever ones you tolerate, carrots, squash, whatever the deal is helpful because they bind up some of the bile acids and pull them out. And then basically what happens, you're pulling out some of the excreted metabolites that the liver has already processed. And so that can be quite helpful overall. Because another thing that people tend to do is it's like this zero fiber, coconut oil, like mostly coconut fat based diet. And that can, I think, be hard on the, depending on the person, hard on the liver and intestine because you don't have the bile flow and like the pulling out of all those different types of things.
Yeah, it's funny. Like, I'm sure we've all encountered it, but somebody who's like, oh man, I can't eat the carrot or the mushrooms or some other fiber. And I'm thinking to myself, like, I have to eat it. Like, it's like, things will go kind of sideways if you don't. So it's similar with liver or oysters or something. I'm not like trying to convince myself to do it. It's like in my best interest to do it. So if
someone's having that sort of an issue with fiber, then that is signifying probably a major overgrowth of certain microbes, bacteria, or fungus or something. So it's an area to address rather than just to avoid.
Yeah.
Well, the bile acids clear out the small intestine. And so when you first start triggering bile acid release and you haven't had it for a while, like I remember we were like all worried about SIBO and this and that from paleo because like gut health was this huge thing. And then I like went low fat or something. It was like you have to do a gut protocol for it. And then it's like I adjust the types of fat I was using because that coconut oil diet is something I did to myself. Like I'm talking about personal experience as well as what I've seen with clients. But when I just changed the fat sources, like all this bloating and like SIBO symptoms changed pretty significantly for me. And I think that just having bile flow, it clears out the small intestine. It triggers a receptor called the farnesoid X receptor that upregulates small intestinal defense. And then also the bile acids trigger motility inside the intestine. So if you're like having really slow bowel movements or like very constipated, some people even find that taking bile acids, whether that's ox bile or Tudcar or something like that, can help to get things going again because it does stimulate intestinal motility. So I think that's actually something that's like all the microbiome talk and all the plant compounds, like people don't talk about how important bile is in the small intestine for intestinal function, for maintaining the microbiome. And also people who are having issues in the colon on really high fat diets and carnivore diets, it's like bile acids are not supposed to go to in large quantities to the colon with protein by themselves. That's a great way to stimulate serotonin production if you're having a bunch of bile acids reach the colon because they irritate the crap out of the colon. Like it's a really bad experience. And if you ever have bile acid diarrhea, if you get your gallbladder removed, you will know that very personally. It's like a really bad time.
I believe it. Yeah, I mean, hypothyroidism, the gallbladder doesn't work well. So, I mean, that question of what color are your stools is pretty meaningful, and then combined with how the digestion is. But shall we move on?
Yeah,
sure.
Let's do it.
Okay. So we got bad takes here, and it seems like Chaffee is becoming a regular on this part of the show. I
don't think we've talked about him yet.
Oh, we haven't? Okay, maybe it's just me.
No, we've just talked about him amongst ourselves and like pulled multiple of his clips, but this is the first time that we're putting them on the show.
Got it. Very nice guy. We'd love to have him on the show.
Yeah, seriously. I mean, as far as having him on, I mean, I know he's been doing some debates with people in terms of carbohydrate intake, and I think that'd be a good one.
100%. Okay, so this is, I don't know what podcast it is from, but do you want to set this clip up, Jay?
Chatting Fit podcast.
Is there anything to say?
Yeah, I don't know what the podcast is from, but essentially he's talking about why we don't want to be consuming fructose. And so both of these clips are describing that. The second one kind of gives him a moment to elaborate on his perspective. And the first one is just kind of surface level, but both have some great points in there that we'll be discussing.
Got it.
Dr. Saladino, I agree with so much of what he talks about, but I just respectfully disagree with him on this one. Sugar is sugar is sugar. Like it's like fructose has been shown very conclusively with hard biochemical evidence. It's not like we got a study that conclude. No, this is actual hard biochemistry. The biochemistry department at University of California, San Francisco, which is a top 10 medical research institution in the world, showed biochemically what fructose does in the body and how it's broken down, the pathways it gets broken down, and the things it gets broken down into. And they found that it actually gets broken down into the exact same byproducts as ethanol. So we get the same damage to our body from eating fructose as we do from ethanol. Get fatty liver disease, cirrhosis, diabetes, heart disease, even implicating cancer and Alzheimer's.
Alcohol without the buzz. Should we comment on that, or should we play the second one?
Well, maybe. I don't know. Maybe we'll just start by talking about the idea of hard biochemical evidence and him referencing UCSF. So for reference, what he's referencing at the University of San Francisco or University of California, San Francisco is Robert Lustig and his work. So he's essentially just parroting that. He's not bringing anything different to the table. As you said, that fructose is alcohol without the buzz. That was the title more or less of Lustig's, one of Lustig's big papers. And yeah, it's, so I don't know how to say this.
Jay is speechless on this issue.
Jay, it's hard biochemical evidence with a side of appeal to authority.
Yeah,
exactly.
He doesn't really say much in this clip, but I'm sure he says more later. Well,
he elaborates on the complexity of his view in the next clip and his deep understanding of these biochemical pathways. But yeah, the idea of citing something as hard biochemical evidence is just so, and then just, I mean, Mike, you said it, like there's appeal to authority and then just some sort of made up idea that Robert Lustig's studies that you're basing this off of are just based on like physiological principles and no larger context, no understanding of the pathways he's mentioning. And we'll dig into the issues with Lustig's perspective, which Chaffee is parroting, in terms of the biochemical pathways that overlap between fructose and ethanol.
The major thing I want to highlight here is that fructose is not broken down into the same byproducts as alcohol. Like, first, that is blatantly false. That's not even close to true. It's not even like debatable that that's what happens. Alcohol is broken down into acetaldehyde and then acetate, and then fructose is broken down into ATP, glycogen, glucose, and lactate. So like they're not even close to the same thing. They don't have the same metabolic pathways at all. And there's problems, very specific and damaging problems with alcohol metabolism that you cannot ascribe to fructose, specifically because of acetaldehyde and the formation of ROS and the causing reductive stress to the liver and all these things that fructose does not do. So it's like there's so much wrong with that statement that it's not even like it. I don't even know if he knows the metabolism between the two if you're making that statement, because they're entirely different. And the outcomes, I guess we'll get into this after the next one, but like if you actually look at the fructose studies and like how they're done and what's going on, like, and then you go through the mechanisms, it's like this is not the same thing in any capacity because of metabolism of fructose and metabolism of alcohol. Like there's other things going on and we'll dig into them. I'll go off on a huge tangent right now because I got frustrated when I watched this, because it's upsetting, because like people will watch this and then they will say, oh, fructose gets metabolized like alcohol, that's why I don't eat it. And then like, I don't know how many clients I've worked with, they're like, oh, I haven't eaten sugar for years because fructose is a poison. And then I bring like fruits and fruit juice back into their diet and like, oh, wow, my digestion's better. I have so much more energy. I'm losing weight. Like my meal prep time is so much quicker because I don't have to cook rice or sweet potatoes every single time. I'm like hitting my potassium requirements and all this type of stuff. Like everything just gets better. And the only reason they avoid it is because of ridiculous arguments like this. Like it's actually quite upset. I get actually a bit frustrated when I see this type of stuff.
Well, I want to move on, but does anybody make the argument that if you drink alcohol, that goes straight to the liver and turns into fat?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's essentially what Lustig's saying.
Got it. But is that how alcohol works? It starts creating DNL in the liver.
Well, it gets converted to acetate, and then acetate can drive de novo lipogenesis.
Got it.
Right.
Plus endotoxin and all that stuff.
That's one of the pathways that can overlap that they're saying is the same. Like they're the same because both could be converted to fat, which is so missing the point and missing the reasoning why that is way more likely to happen with alcohol. And also the fact that that can happen with fatty acids and glucose and any other substrate. So we'll get to it, but because let's let Chaffee teach us the biochemistry in the next one, and then we'll dig into it.
Got it. Okay, here we go.
But fructose.
Wait, let me get my pen and paper. All right, I'm ready.
But fructose is interesting as well because this is the only carbohydrate that is actually metabolized by our liver in the same manner as alcohol and actually broken down into the same byproducts as alcohol, which is a bit scary because those byproducts are exactly the same. And so a gram of fructose is going to turn into the same byproducts as a gram of ethanol. And so this is actually a big deal because we eat a lot more sugar than we drink alcohol. And some people say, well, you don't absorb all of it necessarily, especially if you eat fiber, which is true. And maybe some of that is converted into glucose before it gets to the liver. Possibly there's some studies that suggest that. However, whatever makes it to the liver is going to get processed in the same way and broken down in the same products as alcohol. And we eat a hell of a lot more sugar. You know, alcohol is self-limiting. You're just going to pass out, you know?
Yeah.
And so you can't, you have to stop at a certain point physically.
What are your thoughts?
All right. So let's start at the top, maybe. So in Lustig's, again, Chaffee just saying that like they're metabolized the exact same way as if you had a gram of alcohol and a gram of fructose, you wouldn't know the difference if you looked at all the pathways. They're the exact same in the liver, is for one, entirely false. And two, just demonstrates that he is entirely parroting Lustig and without any concept of what's actually going on here in terms of the hard biochemistry. But so there's essentially two areas of overlap that Lustig points to when it comes to fructose and ethanol. One is de novo lipogenesis, which is the production of fat. The other is the activation of a very generic inflammation pathway, which is the J and K pathway. And so he's saying, look, alcohol increases those things, and so does fructose. So they're the same. And so we're entirely missing some major, major points here. So for one, we're just starting with the DNL pathway, the production of fat in the liver. First thing there is any substrate can be converted to fat in the liver. Glucose, fructose, fatty acids.
Even proteins.
Ethanol,
even amino
protein,
acids can be converted to glucose and then fats. Yeah.
And for reference, when it comes to fatty liver disease, the situation where you have overproduction of fat in the liver, a majority of it comes from fat. It doesn't come from carbohydrate. A majority of that de novo lipogenesis or lipid production and storage in the liver is coming from fat in the first place. The other thing is that when you actually look at the studies that are not feeding insane amounts of pure fructose sweetened beverages or fructose only, you have very, very small amounts of DNL from fructose. Generally, it's like 1% at most. That's normally what you're seeing. What Lustig has done has taken rat studies where they feed pure fructose, which doesn't get absorbed very well and instead goes to feed bacteria, which then produce massive amounts of endotoxin, which then directly causes the liver pathology and favors de novo lipogenesis, reductive stress, reactive oxygen species, all that stuff. That all tends to be downstream of endotoxin. And you see this very clearly when you look at the sorts of studies he cites and the research looking at fructose being problematic in rats. That's one of the main issues is the way that the methods there. The other is that rat livers are way more prone to producing fat from fructose than human livers. They have a very poor storage capacity for fructose. But when you look at human livers, we can handle pretty massive amounts of fructose. And as you said, Mike, that's because there's a ton of things that we do with that fructose before it gets converted to fat. We convert it to glycogen, we convert it to ATP and use it for energy. We convert it to glucose and potentially lactate and other intermediates and send those out to the rest of the body to be used. And then if all of those pathways are essentially full, then the excess amount of fructose will be converted to fat. But the liver, especially human livers, are really good at handling that, especially when they're not under the influence of endotoxin. And even rat livers are pretty decent at handling that if they're not under the influence of endotoxin, because when you look at the studies where they give antibiotics alongside fructose, so you don't have the endotoxin production from the bacteria, it doesn't create fatty liver disease, doesn't create fat production at the liver. And this is not controversial. They've identified, they have the clear graphics and mechanisms and everything, that these are largely endotoxin mediated issues in rat livers. And those are the kinds of studies that Lustig uses to make his argument that liver is just going to produce fat in the liver. So I would say
fructose is just going to produce fat in the liver, right?
Sorry, thank you. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's part one on the DNL side. And then just real quickly on the J and K inflammation side. So this is an inflammatory pathway that is activated basically anytime there's inflammation in the liver. It's not unique to ethanol or unique to fructose or anything else, just a very generic inflammation pathway. And what he's saying in those situations is that when the liver is being given fructose in these contexts of massive amounts of fructose, massive amounts of endotoxin, massive amount of inflammation in the liver, these pathways get activated, and you can do that with fructose in rats, or you can do it with ethanol, and it looks similar. And again, this has nothing to do with fructose. It has nothing to do with how a human liver metabolizes fructose. It has everything to do with endotoxin and other byproducts, other issues here. And so what he's essentially done is said, this is a pathway that fructose can go down, despite the fact that it's heavily disfavored, and ethanol instead is actually heavily favored for it, and has said that these two things are the same. And it's nearly dishonest, except for, again, there's a question of dishonest or just lack of understanding. But also in his papers, he does typically at least clarify that this only happens when glycogen stores are full and the liver is already under stress. He makes these sorts of caveats and they get totally lost in the noise and lost in his presentations and everything else. And of course, lost by Chaffee's parroting of it. And again, we aren't talking about like byproducts. These aren't inherent byproducts or products of fructose versus products of ethanol. These are just possible involved pathways that are heavily disfavored in fructose. It's not like you start with fructose and ethanol, and then after that, everything is the same. Someone who is saying that clearly has no understanding of the biochemistry.
But it's hard biochemistry, Jay. It's hard.
It was studied at
Too
in San
hard
Francisco.
apparently to understand.
Yeah, I mean, there's like you impact like the large portion of these things, but what basically, if anybody wanted to understand what happens when fructose goes to the liver, when it goes to the liver, they actually can break this down in terms of percentages. So about 45% on average gets oxidized, so it creates ATP CO2. A large portion gets can be converted to glycogen. We don't know. A large portion gets actually converted to glucose, about 41% on average. And then a portion of it can also be converted to lactate, about 28% on average. And then the glucose lactate can be exported from the liver to other tissues to be oxidized as substrate. Those are the actual byproducts of fructose metabolism. That's not acetaldehyde, right? It's not heavy amounts of reactive oxygen species and damaged proteins, lipids, and enzymes and components. On the flip side, let's talk about alcohol. So what happens when alcohol gets metabolized? You get acetaldehyde. Acetaldehyde is a toxin. Depending on how much alcohol you drink, the body can process, I think they say in the research, like two drinks on average, and then that'll minimize a lot of the damage. You get acetaldehyde production, and then it gets converted into acetate. Then the acetate can be driven into de novo lipogenesis. We'll talk about fructose de novo lipogenesis in just a second. But so what's the problem with acetaldehyde? So the first thing is when acetaldehyde gets processed by alcohol dehydrogenase, that's the enzyme that breaks down alcohol. So it takes alcohol, converts it to acetaldehyde. You get a crap ton of NADH. So like we always talk about NADH and NAD+. What's the problem with this? Now you have reductive stress. I know that Kate Shanahan doesn't believe that reductive stress exists. There's only oxidative stress. But NADH in large amounts causes reductive stress because it forces the liver to try to oxidize through all of the NADH and alters the NAD plus to NADH ratio. And then something that they talk about with alcohols, because you get such a large amount of NADH production with alcohol, you can actually create hypoxia in the liver cells because the cell is trying to get rid of all of the NADH because this ratio is so altered. And in order to do that, it needs to use oxygen at the mitochondria. And so it'll suck up all the oxygen and portions of the liver won't be able to have it. So you can drive hypoxia. The other thing is that other enzymes that oxidize or metabolize alcohol are the CYP450 enzymes, which produce ROS. And then you have the enzyme catalase, which is involved in the production of ROS. So we'll get to the ROS. But acetaldehyde in its own right can directly damage structures like proteins. So the liver is involved with the production of tons of proteins, right? So your cholesterol proteins like HDL and LDL, acetaldehyde can damage these. Albumin, acetaldehyde can damage these. Collagen, acetaldehyde can damage these. The enzymes, neurotransmitters like dopamine, serotonin, other neurotransmitters inside the brain interact with acetaldehyde and produce toxic components. And also DNA gets damaged as well. So that's, beginning to lead to the production of cancer. The other thing is the ROS that's formed from the enzymatic processes directly damage all of these different components as well. So with alcohol, the direct metabolites of alcohol are toxic. Specifically, acetaldehyde is a toxin. ROS produced during alcohol metabolism is a toxin. Acetate, not so much a toxin, but you have to get acetaldehyde before you get acetate. You don't just go straight to acetate. Now with fructose, lactate is in this context is not a toxin. Glucose is not a toxin. Glycogen is not a toxin. And ATP and CO2 are for sure not toxins. And something else to mention here, and this is for just to, I guess, briefly touch some of the arguments or problems that people talk about with fructose. Fructose's metabolism with glucose only differs in a very minor few steps in glycolysis. And the other problem that we've talked about on the Energy Balance podcast in regards to like the production of uric acid from fructose, that occurs only in massive doses in people who are metabolically compromised. In normal fructose feeding, which always generally in nature, evolutionarily consistent, occurs with glucose, you do not see that happen, especially in healthy people. So that's something that I want to point out there is that the difference between glucose and fructose metabolism is very minor. And in normal circumstances, there's no problems there. It basically, they run through glycolysis, and there's only one step where I think glucose gets converted to fructose 1,6-phosphate, and then fructose goes to fructose 1-phosphate. And that fructose 1,6-phosphate goes to fructose 1-phosphate before they're converted into glycerolaldehyde and I forget what's the other one? I forget the name, whatever the deal is. So basically, they get converted to all the same mediators. So you're not seeing these toxins form from fructose. Now, with fructose specifically, it's not clear that fructose really increases de novo lipogenesis in normal circumstances. So what they see inside the research is that, yeah, triglycerides can increase in fructose. This is actually arguably a good thing. And this is why I'll say it's a good thing. Fructose especially in combination with glucose, increases the oxidation of carbohydrate, which is actually helpful. And then that leads to fatty acids staying inside the bloodstream. And you can see some higher amounts of triglycerides. So essentially, it's like a sparing effect on fatty acids because they're not being oxidized as much anymore because you have this carbohydrate, this substrate coming in. So the de novo lipogenesis argument for fructose doesn't even make sense because the amount is quite low. The last pieces that I want to bring here is around the microbiome piece that you mentioned, Jay. So like the true similarities between fructose and alcohol are only that they can produce endotoxin inside the intestine. That is really the major similarity. And the only time that you see endotoxin in large volumes inside the intestine from fructose is if you feed fructose by itself in large quantities, because the intestine in order for the intestine to absorb fructose in large quantities, you need to have glucose present because there's a co-transporter. They basically lock arm in arm and go across the intestine together. Most people, after about I think it's 10 grams or 15 grams of fructose, somewhere around there, will not absorb the rest of the fructose and it will stay in the intestine. And now you have like a free sugar that can promote bacterial growth. And so in those rat studies, you see large amounts of endotoxin in the portal vein, which is the vein that collects food and components from the digestive tract and delivers it to the liver. So that's really the biggest problem that you're seeing with fructose. And the fatty liver piece is driven by that endotoxin because the endotoxin will signal inflammatory mediators like tumor necrosis factor alpha that induce lipogenesis at the liver. And we've talked about this on other podcasts, and I think even on the last Bioenergetic View, is that the inflammatory mediators are signaling fat production and driving cholesterol production and triglycerides because that binds endotoxin and protects the body from endotoxin. So it's actually a defensive response to the endotoxin just chronically, as with the other stress hormones. It degrades functions. If the liver is constantly exposed to endotoxin and constantly trying to adapt to it, it causes problems because you're driving all this fatty acid oxidation, and eventually the liver can't handle all that. The last thing that I want to say, just a couple of things, is when they talk about human studies for fructose and it being problematic, there's specific problems with them. We already mentioned massive doses of isolated fructose being given. And we talked about the problem with absorption, the microbial components. But in some of the other studies, they inject fructose. And essentially, you could eat between 50 to 150 grams of fructose, and the blood levels of fructose will only increase by 3 to 11 milligrams per deciliter. So usually, like when you're looking at blood sugar, it's measured in milligrams per deciliter. If you ate glucose, especially if you're a diabetic, you can see hundreds of milligrams of deciliter increases in your blood glucose. So fasting blood glucose like 90. After you eat a meal, you can go up to 150. If you have impaired glucose tolerance, you could be in 200s, diabetes even higher. With fructose, you won't see that. It gets metabolized at the liver. So if you're injecting massive volumes of fructose into the bloodstream that you would never see, you're not testing a circumstance that you would normally find. Like, it's a completely moot point. It's like, why would you even do that? It's irrelevant to look at. The next thing is that a lot of the studies are looking at people who are either impaired glucose tolerance, obese, or have diabetes. So they already have problems at their liver. And most people who have diabetes and obesity tend to also have fatty liver disease. So you're putting the people in a circumstance where they have compromised metabolic function and then giving them high doses of singular fructose, which we already talked about the problems with. So it's a ridiculous argument. Then the last piece is most fructose, particularly inside the bioenergetic sphere, that we recommend people getting is from fruit, which includes vitamins, minerals, glucose, fiber, and like a lot of different components that completely change how this entire process looks. So nobody here is arguing to like go and snort lines of pure fructose. That's not what anybody is saying. And I think that the argument gets put to that. It's like, show me a study where fruit causes endotoxemia, fatty liver disease, and diabetes. Like, I would like to see that, because this is like, there's studies that have been talked about ad nauseum inside the bioenergetic sphere where orange juice is protecting against rises in endotoxin from like really crappy meals. It's like, if the fructose was a poison, you wouldn't be seeing it. Such the poison, you wouldn't be seeing that. And also, again, this is like, the context is also really important. So the entire argument, when I look at this, is like, this is ridiculous. I thought we talked about this Lustig stuff years ago.
Yeah, absolutely. So
I was going to say a lie can travel the world, whereas truth is still putting on her boots or something like that.
Right. To clarify one thing I wanted to, just in case it didn't come across, you were mentioning the endotoxin issue with fructose. Again, this is only in the context of having massive amounts of fructose without glucose, which does not exist in nature. You would have to get purified fructose. It doesn't exist in nature. It doesn't exist in processed foods, whether you're talking high fructose corn syrup, which is 55% fructose, 45 glucose, or straight cane sugar or sucrose, which is 50-50. You're never seeing fructose without nearly equal amounts of glucose. If anything, it's only ever slightly more. So that's nearly never a problem in humans eating regular food, as opposed to eating a lab-created fructose-sweetened beverage, which, as you were saying, Mike, not only do they use that in rats, but also in the human studies, they have to use massive amounts of fructose-sweetened beverages in order to try to create an effect even similar to what they're seeing in the rat studies. And we went through some of those when talking about the uric acid situation. And so this argument is essentially the same as what Perlmutter and Rick Johnson talk about in terms of fructose increasing uric acid. Where what they're saying is, in the absolute worst situation where you've got massive endotoxin and fatty liver disease, huge amounts of inflammation at the liver, massive amounts of fructose without any glucose, you will see that fructose increases uric acid, and you will see that fructose increases de novo lipogenesis. So don't consume anything with fructose in it. That is essentially the argument. And in the studies that look at fructose consumption in humans, in order for them to create increases in uric acid, as you said, Mike, they need to be doing this in overweight or obese humans or people with type 2 diabetes. They need to be giving as much as 25% of the total calories from fructose-sweetened beverages. So we're talking massive amounts, hundreds of grams of pure fructose that is not going to be absorbed, will increase endotoxin, and is causing a massive flux to the liver in someone who is already insulin resistant. So it requires things like that, or in another study, in order to do it, they needed to have 35% excess calories beyond their typical caloric needs from pure fructose. Yeah. And I think they might have been looking at non-diabetic people in addition to diabetic.
But that's a surplus study. That's 25% caloric surplus.
35%. Yes. So that's the type of thing that you need to do in order to increase uric acid, which actually in reality just shows how effectively we can handle fructose, if anything. I mean, that should be the takeaway there. Now, again, if we want to talk about what pathway is going to be most, what is going to increase de novo lipogenesis the most, what substrates should we be most concerned about if we're concerned about fatty acid production in the context of fatty liver, it should be fatty acids. We talked about this in our fatty liver series, which was like an 8-part series on Energy Balance podcast, where they look at the fat composition in fatty liver and where it's coming from, and they do the tagging and everything. 75% is coming from fat. 25% is coming from de novo lipogenesis from carbohydrates. So if you're just trying to say, I want to minimize fat production by minimizing a certain substrate, which I don't think is a good idea. I don't think that is how you should be looking at this. I think that's still entirely missing the point. But if you were to do that, then fatty acids are the ones that you should be concerned about. Those are the ones that are metabolized similar to alcohol. And those are the ones that are going to inherently increase reactive oxygen species production in the same way as alcohol and reduce the NAD to NADH ratio in the same way as alcohol. I mean, those are the ones that are mimicking the pathways, not carbohydrate. And again, that is still not a reason to avoid fat. That is just like you need to consider the larger context of what's going on here, as opposed to just looking at these reductionist pathways and trying to extrapolate that out and look at the hard biochemistry. We're just totally missing the point with these kinds of things.
It's just damaging, right? It's damaging to people because it's like, oh, this doctor goes on and says that he knows the hard biochemistry, right, and then can't explain it, but then makes all these bold authoritative claims about how fructose is going to cause Alzheimer's disease and diabetes and cirrhosis and all this type of stuff. It's like those claims aren't even close to correct. Like there is not evidence to show that fructose is causing cirrhosis in humans or diabetes or Alzheimer's disease. So it's like multiple false claims without any evidence, and then appeal to authority as if there was evidence there. And then people will look at that and be like, yeah, this, like, I can't have fructose, because it's also a fear-based model. It's in like authoritative fear-based model. But then you could literally just Google this, a metabolism of fructose, PubMed, metabolism of alcohol, PubMed. And you would just see, like, it'll go to the images and you'll see the images. You'll see like, okay, ethanol, acetaldehyde, fructose, all these different things. And it's like, it's a 2-second. I'm not saying this even for the common person. I'm saying this for a medical doctor. He could go and do this and he could see that this is not these things are not true. These like the pathways and the statements and all this stuff is incorrect. That's like that's what blows my mind. It's like there's not like what level of effort is put into these things before you're making claims to people who are actually trying to make improvements in their health. Like if you're going to make authoritative statements that people are going to follow in some type of way to for their health or for finances or for whatever the psychological components, whatever the thing is, they better well be vetted, right? Like there should be a degree of like really going through and making sure that you're not harming somebody. Like first do no harm on all these levels.
Well, and it's tough for an average person who's listening to these things, they struggle to understand where Chaffee's falling short or like why that isn't reasonable, which is the whole reason why we think it's actually worth doing this and going through it. So hopefully by breaking this down at least a little bit, it gives people something to work off of beyond that, where they can actually try to understand some of the basics here and just see some of those areas where this is nearly made up.
Yeah.
If I understand,
that's the problem.
Yeah. If I understand the last 25 minutes, you guys are saying that fructose goes straight to liver and is turned into fat. Is that right?
You got it.
Okay. I just
something along those lines, Daddy.
Just wanted to
Daddy knows the hard biochemistry at this point.
Exactly.
He must have studied at UCSF.
I studied under Lustig. I was actually his apprentice, so that's incredible. So yeah, I mean, obviously wrong, and I don't know. That's kind of a perfect example of Dunning-Kruger and having the utmost confidence about the issue, but having the least skill to kind of dissect the issue and
it was like the problem is the other problem that I see with this, it's frustrating, is like then this will be posited as a debate, and it's like there is no debate here. There's a bunch of like false claims, and then there's what actually happens, which can be clearly laid out and can clearly be seen. It's like that was like the same thing that we ran into with the BART stuff. It's like this is like the Randall cycle clear is what it is, but it's like this guy's just making his own stuff up as he goes along and then trying to debate that this is the reality of something.
I kind of admire,
it's hard because like if you can't discern, it's difficult, right? If you can't, like if you don't know any of the biochemistry, if you're not understanding how these pathways work or like the physiology in general, it's for the average person, it's like this is really hard to understand because you don't have the context, and that is completely fine. It's not even to bring it. It's not even on the average person per se to understand like a deep level of physiology, anatomy, what's going on with the microbiome and in the biochemical pathways. It's on an authority figure who is providing information to people for some way to help them to be able to say like, look, this is like, I understand what's going on and this is what's going on. That's where that type of component is like, there has to be some degree of ethics there of like, I really need to make sure I know what I'm talking about. And if I don't, let people know like, hey, I'm still figuring this stuff out, so that it's not like fructose cirrhosis. That's it.
With that, should we move on to our last good take, not bad take? So here's our buddy Paul Saladino.
Was there something you wanted to say, Jay?
Oh, sorry. Did you have something else?
You were just mentioning the BART situation, and I guess again, kind of closing out that conversation of how do you know whether to believe Chaffee or not? And I guess I think the only place you could come back to is don't believe anybody. Don't believe us. Don't believe Chaffee. Don't believe BART or Chaffee. Don't believe BART. Like, just do what you can to try to understand what we're talking about. Check out the sources we've referenced and study, for example, on the Energy Balance podcast, of course, we haven't referenced any particular ones here, and try to understand the basics and get what you can out of it, as opposed to dogmatism, tribalism. I like this person's aesthetic more than someone else's. I think the goal here is truth, and none of those things are really going to help. And like immature fighting and calling each other names doesn't get us anywhere. I'm happy to have Chaffee on and let's discuss these things and try to lay it out to the extent that we can. And I don't know how much that will really get us closer to truth, but hopefully it will. I mean, that's the goal here. And I hope for the people listening that we've at least brought to the table some things that they can look into so that they can come to their own conclusions. And I don't think there's another way forward other than that.
Got it. Well said.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's move on to our buddy Paul Saladino. And again, this is a good take, and we just have like a minor critique of it. So here we go.
Regular Gatorade, nature's Gatorade. Watermelon juice, you got orange juice, you got pineapple juice, you got coconut water. These fruit juices are amazing sources of electrolytes, of minerals, and they contain so many compounds found to be beneficial in humans. Do not fear fruit juice. Watermelon juice, we know, improves nitric oxide in the body, involved in blood vessel dilatation. That's probably an amazing natural Viagra. Orange juice contains hesperidin and naringenin. The benefits of orange juice are hard to overstate, improving endothelial function, improving all sorts of indices of immunologic function in humans, lowering the potential of LDL to get oxidized, decreasing cardiovascular risk. Pineapple juice contains bromelain, a compound that protects the gut from organisms like Vibrio cholera and E. coli, and has also been studied and found to lower blood pressure and have other cardiovascular benefits. Coconut water, it's got potassium, it's got magnesium, and all kinds of good electrolytes in there to help quench your thirst. When you go to the gym, when you're working out, why would you use this when you could use some of these?
So again, we're on board with the spirit of that, and Paul has come such a long way. Like him promoting juice on his channel is pretty crazy. But so maybe we disagree with the nitric oxide aspect of that. So without getting too into the weeds on it, how would you frame that, Jay?
Well, yeah, so I agree with the sentiment here, right? We agree with everything there. Gatorade's not a good idea for a number of reasons. Mostly, I mean, artificial colors and things like that. And I guess you could say a lack of polyphenols and nutrients, although I'm pretty sure most of it is sucrose or as opposed to corn syrup. So maybe not even that bad, but I definitely think fruit juice is considerably better. And yeah, I think we agree with all those points. Polyphenols, sugar, electrolytes, all those things are great from fruit juice. The only thing was he was mentioning that with watermelon, because of certain components in there, it can increase nitric oxide. And we're a fan of watermelon. I mean, at least I am. I'm pretty sure you guys are too. Like watermelon juice, that's great. However, I don't think it's really going to be considerably increasing nitric oxide to any extent, which is a good thing, we would argue, because essentially the way I would frame it is that nitric oxide is a backup stress version of carbon dioxide when we're not producing enough carbon dioxide. And so carbon dioxide is the primary vasodilator, the primary oxygenator. It helps our tissues oxygenate, helps us respire, exchange with oxygen at the lungs. So carbon dioxide is really important. And when we're not getting enough, we have to upregulate nitric oxide as a backup stress mechanism. And it does create circulation, like it does, increase the vasodilation and whatnot, which is necessary if, let's say, a muscle is under stress, it needs some extra blood flow and things like that. However, in it being a factor that is involved in stress, it shifts us into a glycolytic stress state, essentially, towards glycolysis and fatty acid oxidation. And it does so by inhibiting certain complexes of the electron transport chain, specifically complex 4 and the utilization of oxygen, along with complex 1, and also some enzymes in the Krebs cycle too, like aconitase. And part of this is nitric oxide itself. Part of it is byproducts of nitric oxide, like reactive nitrogen species, like peroxynitrate, things like that. And so in general, I'd say we don't want high levels of nitric oxide. It's a part of the stress cascade, interferes with mitochondrial respiration or energy production. So yeah, that's the only thing here. But as you were saying, Danny, overall, a good take that we agree with, and just something to mention there with the nitric oxide.
What do you think, Mike?
Yeah, basically, I think that the mechanism they talk about is that watermelon has L-citrulline in it, which can be converted, I think, into arginine, and then arginine's involved as the amino acid precursor for nitric oxide. I think you'd have to have like quite a bit of watermelon juice, though, to get an appropriate dose of L-citrulline for that effect. So, and for me, I wouldn't be prioritizing watermelon juice just because of L-citrulline. There's a ton of other benefits of watermelon juice, assuming you tolerate it. So watermelon does have some FODMAPs. So like for me, I don't tolerate it in super large quantities personally, but if you do tolerate it, I think it's a great fruit source. I think most of the melons are. And yeah, I think you'd have to eat quite a large volume of watermelon to get enough L-citrulline to actually have like a massive effect on nitric oxide overall.
Mike, why don't you like get a new gallbladder or something?
Seriously.
Honestly, I'm waiting for Michael Levin to like create the ability to like, find the specific electrical field and ion channels so that I can regenerate my gallbladder so that my digestive problems won't be like a lifelong thing. But I don't know. Maybe if we get like super big on the podcast and monetize well, we can fund that research for me. We can make like a GoFundMe to regrow Mike's gallbladder. So if anybody's interested,
you could just take Jay's.
But then Jay wouldn't have a gallbladder. Dan.
Oh yeah,
that's cool. Yeah, seriously, Dan, come on, man. You don't care about my gallbladder?
Oh, I'm sorry.
The other thing is, if I had to get Jay's gallbladder implanted on my liver, then I would have to take immunosuppressants the rest of my life, and that's like arguably worse.
I am so dumb. Do they do gallbladder like transplants? Is that even a thing? I didn't think so.
No, but
okay.
It's considered a vestigial organ.
Right, you don't need it.
Seriously?
You don't need it.
No way.
Yeah,
really?
yeah.
Oh wow.
Appendix, gallbladder.
Well, I knew
adenoids, tonsils.
I knew the appendix and those other ones, but I had no idea about the gall. That's like insane.
Yeah, but when they do transplant,
go ahead, Jay.
I was just saying, when they do transplants for like a liver transplant or something, you then typically have to be on immunosuppressants for the rest of your life. Potentially, you might not. There's maybe ways to get around that, or potentially, but in general, medically, that's what they do.
Yeah, and there's problems with them, like Prograf and Cellcept. Those are the two main drugs they use, plus steroids at certain times.
Crazy.
Man, those medications are rough.
Crazy.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of stealing Jay's gallbladder, let's do the last thing here, which is tips and tricks. And I'd be happy to start. But this is more of an observation. But this year has been like the year of cascara. And a lot of people I know have been benefiting greatly from cascara. And I guess it just wasn't super on my radar. And it's not like it's the first time I've ever heard of it. But there were about like 2 or 3 people that used it and overcame really bad constipation and then raved about it to me afterwards. And so I think those experiences really committed it to memory for me. And apparently you need well-aged cascara, and not all cascara is created equally, and you want well-aged cascara from Italy, and you can find it on the internet. But if somebody is experiencing constipation, and here's another thing, I think we've talked about this, but 1 bowel movement per day is constipation. And a lot of people think this is completely normal, and they think like their bowels are good. But if you're only moving your intestine like one time per day, that's going to be an issue, I think. And so getting your thyroid function up should help this. It should induce multiple bowel movements per day. But if it did not, or you were on the fence about thyroid, or et cetera, I'd probably just go to well-aged cascara to give it a shot, because it could radically improve a person's quality of life. And there'd be no reason just like not, unless there was a financial problem or something, but it would just be a quick way to improve a person's health. And so that it's really made an impression on me this year of hearing people talk about it. But
the clinical definition of constipation, Danny, is not going. I think it's like more than after 3 days, it's considered constipation.
Oh, really? Oh, I didn't know that. That's absolutely
in the hospital. That's how we do it. If you don't have a bowel movement for 3 days, the next day we give you laxatives.
That's absolutely nuts. I had no idea. That's crazy.
Yeah, imagine that. Imagine eating food for 3 days and not going.
Well, that's how I was on carnivore, but the stool wasn't hard to pass. And so it was just really long in between bowel movements, but it never felt constipated because I wasn't like struggling on the toilet or something. But been there, but didn't think anything of it. Absolutely crazy.
Well, that's different though, because in carnivore, I think they say you only absorb, or you only have about 5% of the protein you eat go to your colon. So if you ate 200 grams of protein a day on carnivore, you would only have like 10 grams go to the colon a day. So 10 grams of the protein is absolutely nothing, especially because the bacteria will metabolize. And there's not really, if your intestine's really good at absorbing bile acids, then you just literally have protein going there. So that's normal because you don't have bulk. You don't have like fiber. But if you're eating like a regular diet that has fiber and like carbohydrate and all different types of things, and you're not especially if it's like a whole grain diet, like you're just packed with crap for 3 days. It's terrible.
What was normal was the post terrible digestion of carnivore, ruining my digestive tract. Okay. Yeah. Speaking of, so what was your tip this week, Mike?
So mine actually goes along with this general idea that we were actually just talking about. So you kind of segued in nicely. I've had a couple of clients lately who are dealing with issues with coming off carnivore and then having problems with their digestion with protein and bile acids. And so there's a couple of things that I want to mention here to like set the stage and then like what the actual tip is. When you're on a carnivore, like a keto diet, like a heavy meat diet and heavy meat, heavy fat, there's some studies talking about the effects of high fat diets on the actual intestine are problematic because the same metabolic problems that you have with fats and other cells, where you get like ROS, reverse electron transport, the altered FADH and NADH ratios, actually causes metabolic dysfunction inside the intestine. And then, so there's that problem. Then the other problem is that when bile acids go into the colon, they directly cause serotonergic release from the colon because they irritate the colon. And then when proteins go into the colon, the proteins get putrefied by the bacteria and you get a bunch of toxic metabolites, right? So it could be like ammonia, P-cresol, things along those lines. And I think when you run carnivore or like a high fat, high meat keto for an extended period of time, you change the microbiome and you also induce intestinal dysfunction, and it takes time to recover that. And so some of the ways, or the way to kind of deal with that is to, when you start to slowly incorporate fiber sources that you can tolerate pretty well, and make sure that when you're having your protein and fat sources, that you're having the plant-based fiber sources with them, so that you get essentially the fiber and the plant compounds, like the polyphenolic compounds, will dilute the bile acids in the protein so that they're not directly interacting with the colon. They will change the microbiome's fermentation pattern of the amino acids and the bile acids directly, so that you get like different types of bile acids that are less irritating, and then the protein doesn't get created into these toxic compounds. And then they also will bind up the bile acids and pull some of those different things out. So when people first come off carnivore, like, oh, I can't eat, like you were saying, Danny, I can't eat carrots. I can't eat this fiber. I can't eat that fiber. But over time, what you start to do when you start to increase the carbohydrate, when you start to increase the fiber sources that you tolerate, you actually start to realize that, wow, it's actually super helpful to have fiber with your meals. Like for me, if I don't have, especially with the gallbladder thing, if I don't have fiber with my meals, like whether that's fruits or cooked vegetables or even the raw carrots or things that I tolerate, I will actually get digestive issues because of the proteins and the bile acids. So that's one I think is, that's like a really important thing when you're trying to transition from those diets, to slowly incorporate carbs and fiber sources that you tolerate, and do it in a slow and concerted fashion, because you have a metabolic adjustment of the intestine and you have a microbiome adjustment inside the colon as well.
And Jay?
My tip is related to restaurants. And yeah, different vein here, but essentially the tip is to eat out fewer times at restaurants, or be more careful when it comes to eating out at restaurants. The reason I bring this up is because it's something that I see pretty often with clients who are doing, so there's a couple different scenarios. So one is the client who's doing everything right and doing a really great job, but then between social events during the week and weekends, they're eating out at a restaurant maybe 5+ times a week, or even just several times over a weekend. Sometimes alcohol is involved, sometimes it's not. But this can really, really derail progress. Unfortunately, at the vast majority of restaurants, regardless of how nice they are, we're talking about massive amounts of polyunsaturated fats, massive amounts of flours and things added to sauces and meals and whatnot. I mean, even getting a meat and vegetable or starch or something, normally there's going to be huge amounts of vegetable oils used. And so just like something that I wanted to highlight, something that I see really commonly hindering progress for people. And then there's the other subset where they're eating out maybe every lunch, and it's at decent places, right? I mean, they're eating at Chipotle, or they're eating at, they're getting some like what should be natural food, and not recognizing that this is still not only a PUFA issue with something like Chipotle where everything is cooked in rice bran oil, but so often the quality is something that really takes a hit. We're not getting the same quality of things as we would have at home, the same balance in terms of macronutrients. And yeah, just something that I've seen incredibly often. I think just the environment as well isn't always conducive to health. Often like people are drinking a ton of water or drinks alongside their meals, and maybe eating different foods than they normally would. They set out the bread and whatever else beforehand. And yeah, so it was just something I wanted. Yeah, that was my tip, is just trying to reduce that, or considering that as something that could be really holding someone back, even if you're eating at the good places. And it's frustrating that it's not common to like bring your own food to places, or to work for lunch or to like go back home and eat or something. But I think the vast majority of the time it's worth it.
Yeah, I'll add on to this. That's just a sad reality that you can't get non-toxic food 99% of places. And then also, speaking from personal experience, if you have a digestive problem, you like really should try to limit eating out, because you have no clue what additives and stuff are in the food. And I know we just talked about fasting and how bad it was, but in some situations, I would fast versus eating something that it was possible that had an allergen in it that would give me diarrhea for like 2 days, the next 2 days or something like that. Like that's actually not even worth it to me, and I'd rather experience the stress of fasting. And so like, for example, when I would fly to Japan or something like that, like I would search the whole airport for anything it was good food. But if I couldn't find anything, I would go to the Starbucks and get like full fat milk and sugar and coffee, and just try to get as many calories as possible with that. And if they didn't have something like that, like I would fast, because having an upset stomach or something on the airplane is not worth it to me. It's not like, oh, I just got to eat at this Arby's, because I can't find any food and I can't like experience a stress response. The result of eating an irritating food is actually, at least for me, worse than like just throwing caution into the wind. And so again, everybody has to make their own judgment on this stuff. But again, if you have a history of inflammatory digestion, it can be really challenging.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%.
Yeah. Go ahead, Mike.
I was going to say I agree only from like a time perspective, because if I eat something that messes my stomach up, like I have to deal with it the next day. Whereas if I fast for just that period of time for that meal, I just deal with it there. Although for the airport, I usually bring like macadamia nuts and dried fruits and things like that. And I'll buy a bunch of coconut water, or they have orange juice there. It's not that great, but at least in the US airport, it's pretty good. And internationally, like here in Asia, the food in the airport is terrible, like terrible options.
Really.
But one thing I want to mention is that even in like really high class restaurants, they do this type of stuff. So I remember when I finished my contract working in the ICU in Texas, and we went out to like, my wife and I have this like tradition. We go out to like a nice steakhouse after we finish a contract. Like that last day, we'll go out together. And so at that point, Harrison was living with us. So he came with his wife as well. And we were out there, we were ordering like really expensive steaks. And so I'm thinking that, we're paying so much for these steaks, and we don't usually do that, just like for the tradition. So they have to be cooked well, right? Like they should be using good ingredients. And Harrison's like, bro, that they rub that in like vegetable oil.
Yeah.
And I was like, no way. There's no way that they rub the steak in vegetable oil. And he's like, I bet you money they do. So he asked the waiter, and the waiter's like, oh yeah, we rub it in grapeseed oil. And I was like, why? Why would you take this like really high quality cut of meat and destroy it by rubbing it in a polyunsaturated fat and then cooking it at high temperatures? Like that is like literally one of the worst things that you can do from like a health perspective. So Harrison like asked them to do it in butter and all this stuff, and they accommodated. But yeah, for me, that was eye-opening, because for a period of time, even recently, I was like, oh, I'm going to a better restaurant. So they would be using good ingredients, right? But it's actually, I think it's unlikely to be the case. The other thing I want to just add to that is aged meat inside restaurants is hugely problematic for some people's digestion. Like for me, if I eat a bunch of aged meat, I'm having a bad time. And I think that's because when they age the meat, you can get, depending on how it's aged, the processing, you can get like certain breakdown products that can be really irritating for some people.
I don't want to belabor the point, but it can be even worse than that, because I talked to somebody that worked for years in high scale restaurants, and they told me that like part of their routine every day was just rubbing the steaks in canola oil. so it's like already done. Like it's not like they do it every single time they get the steak. So it's again, it's a landmine. Some places might be able to work it out, but it's always going to be up in the air of what happens. And so, yeah, go ahead.
And
Jay.
Portugal was better. Yeah. When we were in Portugal, they caught the fish. Like they're like, oh, we don't have enough fish, or we don't have enough oranges. Like we're going to go to the store and go get them. And then they would like be like, we would go to the same restaurant, and it'd be like, on this day, this is the fish we caught today. And then you come back the next day, we don't have that fish. We caught this fish today. Mm-hmm. And then all they would do is they would take the fish and they just grill it. They didn't put anything on it. They didn't do anything. They just straight up grilled it. And then the guy, it was actually kind of funny, because like we all ordered orange juice. And so the guy's sitting there juicing the orange juice, and he's like juicing it into the pitcher. Then he just takes a drink to make sure it's good, and he pours all of our orange juice. Like
genius.
So super fresh, like super like no poof oils and things like that. And when they did cook, I mean, not the best, but they would cook in olive oil. So it was like the food there is amazing. Like I didn't have a problem eating out there, but in the US, man, every time it's a problem. Like it literally is, I think the minefield or landmine is the best way to describe the eating out. If you have to do it because that's your lifestyle, there's ways to work around it. But if you have the option to not do it, I think it's probably better overall.
Yeah. Even other things you think are safe. So you mentioned steak, but another one is like rice, right? With rice, they'll use a lot of vegetable oil too. And so with the aged meat thing that you were mentioning, Mike, I remember Ray had a really funny quote about it, talking about how they, somehow like, they convinced us to eat the steaks instead of the more collagenous cuts. And then started to like, because those are tougher often, if, depending on how the meat's raised, then they serve you rotten meat because it's more tender. And like have convinced you that that's like tastier.
Yeah.
I don't remember, obviously that wasn't the exact quote, but it was something about that, which I always thought was funny. But I do think when it comes to dealing with these circumstances, whether we're talking restaurants or, an airport or something, or when there's no good food available, obviously we're kind of dealing with a suboptimal condition, that an environment. When it comes to restaurants, I think if you can become comfortable with being annoying and asking what things are cooked in and requesting that it's cooked in something else, I think most of the time it's worth it. And so that's something to consider. Another thing along with that is I would just always have food with you. When you leave the house, bring, we're talking dried fruit and jerky and maybe juice and chocolate, whatever
nuts,
it is.
Macadamia nuts.
Yeah, macadamia nuts.
Gushers,
whatever
fruit
it is.
by the foot, Pillsbury strudels.
Pop-Tarts,
granola bars. Sorry, Jake.
Exactly. And I mean, I think it's always a good idea because you don't always know what you're going to get hit with, and you might, think you're going to be back in time for lunch, but you're not, and so it's always good to have it with. Or when you're at a place like an airport and you think there will be decent food and there's not, at least you always have something that's decent, and I think that's generally preferable to fasting. But then there is that question that you guys were both saying, where sometimes that you're going to feel bad enough from whatever the food is then it's worth skipping the meal. And that's totally individual. For some people, they really don't have an issue if they're eating the pizza, and gluten and things like that, or if they have the vegetable oil for that meal. And for them, it's worth it to eat and avoid the stress that they would have from not eating. And it's worth it for the social event. And that's okay too. Like, there's no judgment on that choice. It totally is up to the individual. And I literally mean that. Sometimes I will eat things that I know are suboptimal because it won't affect me the next day. And I know what those things are and what those things aren't. So it's an individual question, but I think, something worth considering and worth thinking about. And it might not look like what you expect. So Mike, you were mentioning orange juice at the airport. And I know for me, I found really terrible orange juice that's sour and just not worth it. And so I would rather get something that's pure cane sugar, whether it's a tea that I just put a bunch of bags of white sugar in or something like that, over the orange juice. But again, it's all totally individual. So.
Yeah, I had 2 packs of Dunkaroos before this and a Fanta, and I feel fine. So I totally know what you're saying, Jay. Okay, with that, we should wrap up. Appreciate you guys. And any closing words, Mike?
No, happy to be here. Looking forward to the next episode. If anybody wants to find my work, they can find me in Energy Balance or MikeFave.com.
Got it. And Jay, where can we find more of your work on the internet this week?
Yeah, my website is jayfeldmanwellness.com, and Mike and I do a podcast called the Energy Balance Podcast.
T.me/DannyRoddy and DannyRoddy.substack.com. Okay, guys, thank you so much. Peace out. Take care. Talk to you guys soon. Bye-bye.